I'd rather lose every acre of this ranch than spend my life married to a woman I chose off your list, Dad. Marcus Brennan set down his glass. Slow. Deliberate. The way a man sets something down when his hands need to be free for what comes next. The 5 families sitting in that parlor went dead silent. Then you'll lose it, Marcus said. Fine. Thomas pushed back from the table and stood. Because the woman I'm choosing doesn't have land or money or a family name. She has $32 saved and calluses on her hands from working your stable. He looked his father straight in the eye. And she's worth every acre you're threatening to take. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and let's find out together just how far this story travels. The stage from Abilene ran 3 days late because of washed-out creek crossings, and by the time it lurched into Willow Creek, Margaret Sullivan had eaten nothing but a heel of bread and a hard-boiled egg she'd rationed across 46 hours of rattling misery. She stepped down onto the street with both bags in hand, her hat pinned at an angle that suggested she still had standards, and looked at the town the way a general surveys a battlefield she isn't sure she can win. Willow Creek was not what the advertisement had implied. Nothing about it was soft. The main street was packed dirt, baked to something approaching stone, and the buildings that lined it had the look of men who'd given up on impressing anyone. A saloon with a leaning sign. A dry goods store with a board missing from its porch. A livery that smelled like it was losing an argument with itself. 2 women standing near the post office watched Margaret step off that stage with the particular expression of people who have been somewhere long enough to recognize a newcomer by the specific kind of hope still visible in her posture. That hope was in Margaret's case real, and necessary, and quietly terrified. She had arrived with 2 bags, $12.40. The name of a ranch written on a scrap of newspaper, and the understanding that if this did not work out, there was no plan remaining. Philadelphia was gone. The house was gone. The accounts, which had turned out to be entirely fictional, constructed with patient and elaborate care by a man she had believed in for 19 years, were gone. Edward Sullivan had died 8 months ago, and in dying had revealed himself to be someone she had never actually known. The debts were real. The creditors were real. The looks from people who had once called themselves friends were very, very real. She had not allowed herself to fall apart. She did not have that luxury. The advertisement had been folded into thirds in a copy of the Philadelphia Inquirer, pushed to a back page between notices for patent medicines and a request for a seamstress in Topeka. Cook wanted. Circle M Ranch, Willow Creek, Kansas. Room and board included. Serious applicants only. Apply in person or by letter to J. Caldwell. She had written the letter on a Tuesday. By Thursday, she had decided not to wait for an answer. She asked for directions to Circle M from the man who ran the dry goods store, who looked at her over the counter with a kind of frank assessment that would have insulted her 6 months ago, and now barely registered. "You the one who wrote Jake Caldwell about the cook position?" "I am." "Huh." He pulled at the side of his mustache. "You know, it's a working cattle ranch, not a boarding house. The advertisement specified," Margaret said. "I can read." He gave her directions. She thanked him with exactly the warmth the situation warranted, which was very little, and walked back out to arrange her bags on a wagon that was heading that direction. She arrived at Circle M Ranch in the late afternoon, and the first thing she noticed was the size of it. Not the land she'd expected land, but the feeling of it. The way the silence was layered. There were sounds, certainly cattle somewhere in the distance, the rhythmic strike of metal on metal from near the barn horses. But beneath all of it was something vast and indifferent, the quiet of a place that did not require her presence and would not adjust itself on her behalf. A boy of about 16 appeared from the direction of the barn, stopped when he saw her and stared. "Is Mr. Caldwell available?" Margaret asked. The boy turned without a word and disappeared back toward the barn. She stood by the wagon for 4 minutes. She counted them. Then Jake Caldwell came around the corner of the main building, and she understood immediately why the advertisement had specified serious applicants only. He was not a man who invited casual conversation. He was somewhere past 40, Lean the way working men are lean, not thin, but reduced to exactly what the work required. He moved with the economical certainty of someone who had stopped wasting motion a long time ago. His face was the kind that showed its history without volunteering the details. He looked at her bags first, then at her. "You're the one from Philadelphia. Margaret Sullivan. You come a long way for a cook job." "I came the distance necessary," she said. "That's all." He was quiet for a moment, studying her the way you study a horse you're not sure about yet. Not unkind, just honest. "How old are you?" "Old enough to know what I'm doing." She held his gaze. 43. "You ever cooked for more than a household?" "I ran a household with dinner parties for 20. I cooked for church socials that fed 60. I understand scale." "This isn't a dinner party," he said. "I didn't travel 900 miles looking for a dinner party." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, not quite, but an adjustment. 15 men, he said. 3 meals a day. The kitchen's in the main house. Stove is—" He paused. "Temperamental." "I've managed temperamental before." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he picked up one of her bags. "I'll show you the kitchen." The kitchen was large by ranch standards, which meant it was cramped by any other measure. A massive cast-iron range dominated one wall, black and elaborate and utterly imperious. A long work table scarred with years of use. Shelves of mismatched crockery. A window that looked toward the bunkhouse. A woman named Clara, who turned out to be the wife of the foreman, and who had been managing meals in a desperate and increasingly resentful fashion for the 3 weeks since the previous cook had quit, was standing at the range when they walked in. She was stirring something with the energy of a person who has been doing something she never agreed to do. "Lord Almighty," Clara said when she saw Margaret. "You're real." "Clara," Jake said. "This is Mrs. Sullivan from Philadelphia. She's going to be taking over the kitchen." Clara put down her spoon and grabbed both of Margaret's hands with the grip of a woman rescuing another woman from something they both understood without saying. "You can cook. I can. Real food. Not just—" Clara gestured at the pot behind her. "What's in there?" "I genuinely cannot tell you. I believe it started as beans." "I can cook real food," Margaret said. Clara looked at Jake with an expression that was frankly accusatory. "You should have placed that advertisement 6 months ago." Jake had already turned and was heading back toward the door. Over his shoulder he said, "Dinner's at 6. Men will be in from the south pasture by 5:30. Margaret looked at the clock on the shelf. It was 4:15. "Wait," she said. He stopped. "You haven't confirmed the position. We haven't discussed terms." He turned back. "Room and board same as the advertisement. Separate room at the back of the house. Sunday afternoons are your own." "And if I don't work out?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then you don't work out." "I need to know the terms of dismissal. I'm not a woman who can afford surprises." He looked at her steadily. "You'll have 2 weeks' notice unless there's cause. Cause would be—" He paused. "Well, it hasn't come up." "And the previous cook, why did she leave?" The pause this time was a fraction longer. Jake said. "And he left because—" Another pause. "He said it was too quiet." Margaret looked around the kitchen at the evidence of a place that needed her at the stove that squatted against the wall like a challenge. "I've been living in too much noise," she said. "Quiet sounds like a relief." He looked at her one more time, that same measuring look. Then he said something she would think about for weeks afterward. "There's one other condition." "All right. This ranch—" He stopped. Started again. "These men work hard. They're out before sunrise, and they come in tired. What they need isn't just food. They need—" He seemed to find the word uncomfortable. "Spirit, lightness. Something that makes the evening feel different from the rest of the day." He looked at her directly. "I won't keep a cook who can't bring that. I've tried it. A kitchen that's just a kitchen isn't enough out here." Margaret wasn't sure she'd understood him. "You want me to entertain them?" "No," he said. "I want you to season the food with laughter." The silence that followed was complete. "That's not a measurement," she said carefully. "No," he agreed. "It's not." And then he walked out, leaving her with Clara and the pot of uncertain beans, and 45 minutes until 15 hungry men came through the door expecting dinner. Clara, bless her, was practical in the face of crisis. "The pantry's through there," she said, already moving. "He laid in good supplies last month, so you've got what you need. The stove—" She hesitated. "Tell me about the stove." "The damper sticks. There's a trick to it, but I never learned it properly. Old Ray the cook before he knew it, but he left without explaining." Clara pulled open the firebox door. "The heat runs high on the left side and cold on the right. Don't put bread on the left side." "How long has it been like this?" "Always, I think. You learn to work around it." Margaret approached the stove the way you approach something that has already made its intentions clear. She adjusted the damper, felt the resistance, adjusted it differently. The draw changed not perfectly, but better. "All right," she said more to herself than to Clara. "All right." She went to the pantry, took inventory in 90 seconds, came back out. "Potatoes, onions, salt pork. Do you have flour?" 2 sacks. "And the milk situation?" 2 cows, good ones. Then we're making something they can actually eat." She tied on the apron that was hanging by the door, too big for her, designed for someone with different geography, and pushed up her sleeves. "Clara, do you need to be somewhere else?" "I would very much like to be somewhere else." "Then go. I've got it." Clara paused in the doorway. "You sure?" Margaret had her hands already in the flour. "Not remotely," she said. "But I'm doing it anyway." She had 43 minutes. She made a thick potato soup, call it a stew really, with the salt pork cut fine and the onions rendered down until they were sweet bread to go alongside it, because there was time if she moved fast, and a pan of cornbread to stretch the whole thing, because 15 men were always more than you calculated for. The bread fought her. The left side of the stove lived up to its reputation. She pulled the first pan before it became a problem, moved it right, adjusted everything. Burned 2 fingers doing it. Kept moving. At 5:32 she heard them coming. Not 1 or 2 men, 15 of them boots on the porch, the sound of a day's work, unwinding voices overlapping. She heard the door to the main house open. She heard the sound of them settling at the long table in the next room. Then she heard the silence that meant they were waiting. She picked up the first pot and walked through the door. The table ran the length of the room, and the men around it represented every age and condition you'd expect from a working cattle ranch. Young men barely past 22 or 3 who'd been at it long enough to have made peace with the permanence of saddle leather, a man with a hand wrapped in a bandage that was already not clean enough. They looked at her with the particular expression of men who have learned that expectations in general lead to disappointment. She set the pot on the trivet at the center of the table. "Gentlemen," she said, "I'm Mrs. Sullivan. I've been in your kitchen for approximately 45 minutes, so I'll ask you to grade on a curve this evening. Dinner is potato and salt pork stew, bread and cornbread. I know that doesn't sound like much." Silence. "But," she said, lifting the lid, "I put everything I had into it." The smell hit the room, and she watched something happen that she hadn't expected. The silence didn't stay hostile. It changed texture. 2 of the younger men leaned forward, almost involuntarily. The man with the bandaged hand sat up straighter. Someone at the far end of the table made a sound that was very nearly involuntary appreciation. She began to serve. Jake Caldwell, she noticed, sat at the head of the table. He watched her work without expression. She did not look at him directly. She moved around the table methodically, making sure the portions were even, making sure everyone had bread. When she got to the youngest man at the table, he couldn't have been more than 19, with a face that still looked faintly surprised to find itself on a cattle ranch. He looked at the bowl and then up at her and said with complete sincerity, "This smells like home, ma'am." She hadn't expected that. She felt it land somewhere under her sternum, and had to hold very still for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "That's the nicest thing anyone said to me in about 8 months." A man across the table, older with a gray-streaked beard, looked up. 8 months is a long time to go without a kind word." "It is," she agreed. "What happened 8 months ago?" She served the last bowl before she answered. "My husband died," she said. "And then I found out he'd lied to me for 19 years. She set the ladle down. "So I came here." The silence that followed was a different kind entirely. Then the youngest man, the one who'd mentioned home, said very quietly, "Well, you're here now." "I am," she said. "And so is the stew. Eat while it's hot." They ate. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the sink and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to feel the weight of the day. The traveling, the uncertainty, the 43-minute miracle she'd just managed to pull off. And then she picked up a cloth and started washing the pot. Behind her, through the door, she heard something. Conversation. Real conversation. Not the careful silence of men who are being watched, but actual voices overlapping someone. Laughing at something, the sound of a table that has been fed, and is now alive in the way that fed people become alive. She hadn't done that on purpose. She hadn't planned it. She'd simply put everything she had into the pot and walked through the door, and somehow that had been enough to crack something open. She thought about what Jake had said. Season it with laughter. She still didn't know what that meant exactly, but she thought she was beginning to understand what it was in service of. Ian. He came into the kitchen after the men had cleared out. She was finishing the pots. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the percolator on the stove, still hot, because she'd kept it, and stood at the window. "Stew was decent," he said. "It was the best I could do in 45 minutes. "I know." She kept washing. "The stove's left side runs too hot. Old Roy had a way with it. So will I by morning. I just need to understand its moods." She rinsed a bowl. "The way you understand a person's moods." He was quiet. "How long have you been running this ranch without a cook?" she asked. 3 weeks with Clara holding it together. Before that, about 6 months of patching it. Why is it so hard to keep one? He turned the cup in his hands. "It's isolated. The work is relentless. And—" He paused. "Some people come out here thinking the frontier is one thing and find out it's another." "What did they think it was?" "Simpler," he said. "Cleaner. Like starting over is easy." She thought about that for a moment. Starting over isn't easy. It's just necessary sometimes. He looked at her. "Is that what this is for you? Starting over?" "I don't know yet what it is," she said honestly. "Right now it's just getting through today." He nodded slowly. "That's usually how it starts." She set the last pot to dry and turned to face him. "Mr. Caldwell, that condition you mentioned, about laughter." I'm a practical woman. I understand keeping the men's spirits up, that part I can work with. But I need you to tell me what specifically you mean by it, because I don't do things I don't understand." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "My wife—" He stopped. "She died 4 years ago. Fever. My boy with her, he was 6. He looked down at the cup. Before she died, when this house still had—" He stopped again. The kitchen was different. There was always something happening in there. Something that made the men feel like they were coming home to something, not just a place to sleep before more work. He set the cup down. After she was gone, the kitchen became just a kitchen. And I felt it. The men felt it. The whole ranch felt it, like something essential had been taken out of the walls. His jaw worked for a moment. 3 cooks later, I started putting it in the advertisement. Not because I thought anyone would understand what I meant, but because I couldn't think of another way to say what I needed. Margaret stood very still. "And tonight," she said carefully. He looked at her for a long moment. "Tonight," he said, "those men came in from 12 hours of work in cold weather and sat down to a meal made by a woman who'd been in their kitchen for less than an hour. And by the time they'd eaten, they were talking to each other, the way they haven't talked in months. He picked up his hat. Whatever it is you did, Mrs. Sullivan, I can't name it either. But I know I need it. He walked to the door, stopped. Your room's down the hall, second door. Clara made it up this morning. Thank you. He nodded. Mr. Caldwell. He paused. I'm sorry, she said. About your wife and your son. He was still for a moment. Thank you, he said. It's the first time in a while someone said that like they meant it. He walked out. Margaret stood alone in the kitchen she'd just won 45 minutes at a time, listening to the settling sounds of a ranch house at the end of a day, and understood something she hadn't known when she'd stepped off that stage. She had not arrived at a job. She had arrived at the wreckage of something that had once been whole, and the man who ran it was quietly, stubbornly, determinedly trying to put it back together without knowing exactly how, without any guarantee it would work, just because he believed it was worth trying. She understood that feeling down to her bones. She turned off the kitchen lamp and went to find her room. The second day began at 4:45 in the morning, when the cold woke her before the light did. She lay still for exactly 60 seconds, a habit from Philadelphia, those long, awful months of lying in bed, tallying what she'd lost. And then she made herself get up, because she had learned that stillness for her was the enemy. The kitchen was dark and cold. She built the fire in the range from the wood box beside it, remembered what Clara had told her about the damper. Tried the adjustment she'd worked out the night before. The draw caught. The left side still ran hot, but she was already planning around it. She had breakfast ready. Biscuits, salt pork, a pot of oatmeal coffee strong enough to stand up on its own by 6 o'clock. The men came in ones and twos. The youngest one, she'd learned his name was Tommy. 18 years old, out from Missouri, appeared, first looked at the table with the expression of a man seeing proof that yesterday had not been a dream, and sat down with a sincerity of purpose that made her smile. Biscuits, he said. Biscuits, she confirmed. Real ones. She put one in front of him. He took a bite. His eyes closed for a moment. Ma'am, he said, I don't know what Philadelphia did to you, but I'm glad you left. She burst out laughing before she could stop herself. It was the first time she'd actually laughed, not the polite social performance of it, in longer than she could precisely calculate. Tommy looked startled. Then he grinned. Then the man coming through the door behind him. Hector the foreman, Clara's husband, a compact and dignified man of 47, stopped and looked between the two of them. What? Hector said. Nothing, Margaret said, still laughing. Sit down, eat. Hector sat. 2 more men came in. The sound of the table filling up, of coffee being poured, of biscuits being passed was so ordinary and so essential that Margaret stood at the range and felt something dangerous begin to happen inside her chest. Hope. Small and fragile and absolutely unwelcome, because hope required you to be invested in an outcome, and she had recently learned what happened when outcomes failed. She pushed it back. There was work to do. By the end of the first week, she had learned the stove well enough to stop fighting it and start negotiating with it. She had learned which men had food preferences that mattered. Hector could not eat anything with too much pepper due to a stomach complaint he would never directly admit to, so she simply stopped using it heavily. Tommy would eat absolutely anything with butter on it. A man named Garrett, who never said more than 4 words at a meal, would always eat 2 servings of anything with dried apple in it, which told her something about where he'd come from. She had also learned that the kitchen as a physical space was the center of gravity of the ranch in ways that had nothing to do with food. Men came to the kitchen outside of mealtimes, not often and not without purpose. A cup of coffee, a question about the bread, once a request from Tommy if she had anything for a headache, which she did, because she'd brought a small medicine kit from Philadelphia, on the principle that a woman should always have one. She gave him the headache remedy and didn't mention it again, which she suspected was what he needed her to do. She began to understand Jake's condition more precisely. The kitchen wasn't just about food. It was about what food represented evidence that someone cared enough to pay attention to learn what people needed to show up every morning before they did and have something ready. That was not a small thing in a place where people worked until their bodies stopped working and then worked some more. The laughter was harder. She didn't manufacture it. She had never been able to manufacture it even in the Philadelphia social circles where performance was currency. But she found that it arose naturally in the kitchen when she stopped protecting herself so carefully. She told Tommy one morning when he arrived early and found her wrestling with a pie crust that was not cooperating exactly what she thought of pie crust and its relationship to the concept of justice in the universe. The rant was approximately 2 minutes long and completely sincere. By the end of it, he was leaning against the doorframe, barely holding himself together, and she was laughing at her own frustration, and the pie crust in the distraction had actually come together correctly. "You're funny," Tommy told her as if this surprised him. "I'm furious," she corrected. "It just comes out the same way sometimes." She saw Jake standing in the hall doorway. She didn't know how long he'd been there. His expression was the one she was beginning to be able to read, not blank, as she'd originally thought, but contained. He had learned to hold everything very far inside, and what showed on the surface was the controlled version. But his eyes this morning were different. Something in them that she didn't have a name for yet. He walked to the stove, poured his coffee, and said without looking at her, "Pie for supper." "If the crust cooperates," she said. "It'll cooperate," he said. "How do you know?" He looked at her then. "Because you won't let it do otherwise." He walked out. Tommy looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at the doorway. "He doesn't say things like that," Tommy said. "Generally." "Like what?" "Things that sound like—" Tommy searched for the word. "Like he's paying attention." Margaret turned back to the crust. "Eat your breakfast," she said, "before it gets cold." But she was smiling at the work table, quietly to herself. And the pie that evening was extraordinary. She made sure of it. On the 9th day, she found the box of books. It was at the back of a shelf in the pantry behind 2 sacks of rice she'd been reorganizing. A wooden crate, not large, filled with maybe 20 books, battered, well-read, some with cracked spines. She pulled one out. Walt Whitman, Leaves of Grass. She pulled out another. Tennyson. Another, a collection of American poetry she didn't recognize, worn through at the binding. She put them back carefully, thought about it for the rest of the day. That evening, after the men had eaten and the kitchen was clean, she found Jake on the porch. It was the first time she'd sought him out specifically. "The books in the pantry," she said without preamble. He looked at her. "Were they your wife's?" He was quiet for a moment. "Some of them." "The poetry." "She loved Whitman," he said. "I never understood it, but I kept the books." Margaret sat down on the step, not beside him, but close enough to be in the same conversation. "I used to read in the evenings," she said. "Before. We had a good library." She looked out at the dark. "I haven't been able to read since Edward died. I pick up a book and the words don't stay." "It'll come back," he said. "You sound certain." "No," he said. "I just know it came back for me." He paused. "Eventually." She turned to look at him. In the dark, he was harder to read, which she suspected was why he favored evenings. "What did it come back with?" she asked. He thought about that for a long moment. "With the understanding that the person I lost, she was part of how I read before, and after I had to learn to read differently, without her voice in my head for every line I liked." He looked out at the dark. "It took a long time, but it came back different. Not less. Just mine." Margaret was quiet for a long time. "Mr. Caldwell," she said finally. "Jake," he said. "You've been here 9 days. You can call me Jake." "Jake." She stood. "Thank you." He looked up at her. "For what?" She thought about how to answer that. For telling the truth. For not pretending that loss is something you get over. For still having the books. "For the porch," she said. "And the quiet." She went inside. Behind her, she heard something she almost missed. A quiet sound, almost nothing. But she was certain. In the way you are certain of things, you cannot prove that for just a moment. In the dark of his own front porch, Jake Caldwell had almost smiled. She would have said, if anyone had asked, which no one did, that she was managing well. That was the word she used inside herself, managing. It implied competence without attachment. It left room to leave if leaving became necessary. But on the 12th night alone in her room, after the ranch had gone quiet, she opened the box she'd carried from Philadelphia, the one she hadn't touched since she'd arrived, the one that held what was left of her previous life, and she sat on the edge of her bed and held the photograph of herself and Edward on their wedding day. She did not look the way she'd expected to look looking at it. She waited for grief. She found something more complicated, a grief for the marriage she'd thought she had, which had never existed, and a grief for the woman in the photograph who had believed with her whole heart in something that turned out to be a beautiful, catastrophic lie. "You deserved better," she told the woman in the photograph. "You deserved the truth." She put the photograph back in the box, closed it, slid it under the bed. Then she lay down in the dark of a Kansas ranch house in a room that was not hers, and was also slowly, improbably, beginning to feel like it might be, and she listened to the sounds of the place settling around her. And for the first time in 8 months, she did not feel afraid of the morning. She felt something she had almost forgotten the name of. She felt ready. The morning of the 13th day, Margaret burned the biscuits. Not slightly. Not in the way where you scrape the bottom and serve them anyway, and nobody says a word, because the alternative is nothing. She burned them completely black on the bottom, dense in the middle smoke, curling up from the range in a way that made Tommy, who came in early, as always, stop in the doorway and say nothing, which was somehow worse than if he'd laughed. She looked at the pan. She looked at what was in it. "Well," she said. "I didn't say anything," Tommy offered. "You were thinking it." "I was thinking maybe I wasn't that hungry." She picked up the pan, walked to the back door, opened it, and set the whole thing outside in the cold air with the methodical calm of a woman deciding not to have a reaction she couldn't afford. Then she came back in, washed her hands, and started over. "What happened?" Tommy asked, sitting carefully at the table, as if sudden movements might destabilize the situation further. "I didn't sleep well." "How come?" She measured flour with the focus of someone using the task to keep themselves level. "Dreams," she said. "Old ones." Tommy was quiet for a moment. Then, with the particular courage of a 19-year-old who doesn't yet know which questions not to ask, "About your husband." "About my life," she said. "Which included him, and then didn't." He thought about that. That must be strange. Having a whole life and then not having it. "It's strange," she said. "And then you get up and make biscuits and burn them, and the strangeness has to wait, because there are 15 men who need to eat at 6 o'clock. She glanced at him. "That's not a complaint. That's actually what saves you." He nodded slowly, with more understanding than she'd expected from someone his age. "My dad died when I was 12, he said. "What saved me was the cows. You still had to feed them. They didn't know to wait." She looked at him. He was looking at the table, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Tommy," she said. "Ma'am?" "You're going to be all right," she said. "In general. As a person." He looked up surprised. Then he grinned, that open, uncomplicated grin that made him look even younger. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I expect so." The second batch of biscuits was perfect. She put them on the table at 5:58 and felt the specific satisfaction of a problem solved through stubbornness rather than skill, which was she was learning usually how things got solved out here. Jake came in last, as he always did, and sat at the head of the table, and she watched him notice, without any visible reaction, that the biscuits were slightly late. His coffee was already poured, because she'd learned exactly when to have it ready. He picked it up, looked at the table, and looked at her. She met his eyes, said nothing. He said nothing. He drank his coffee, he ate his biscuits, he left. But he paused at the kitchen door on his way out and said without turning, "Whatever happened this morning, you fixed it. She was already at the sink. "I always do," she said. She heard something that might have been agreement, or might have been something warmer than that, and then he was gone. The trouble started on the 15th day, and it started with a man named Deke Harlan. She had not paid particular attention to Deke in the first 2 weeks, which was partly her mistake. He was somewhere past 50 heavyset, with the particular manner of a man who had been somewhere long enough to have opinions about who belonged and who didn't. He sat at the far end of the table and ate without speaking, and looked at things longer than was strictly necessary. She had categorized him as private and moved on. She should have looked closer. It began with small things. A bowl returned to the kitchen with less than half its contents consumed, and no explanation. A comment made to the man beside him, but loud enough to carry about how the coffee had been better before. Nothing direct. Nothing she could address without seeming like she was overreacting to nothing. Then on the 15th day, Garrett came into the kitchen after supper while she was cleaning up. Garrett was the quiet 1-4 words at a meal on a good day, and the fact that he'd sought her out specifically was enough to make her stop and pay attention. "Deke's been talking," Garrett said. She kept her hands in the wash water. "About what?" "About you." He was looking at the window over the sink. "Says you won't last. Says a woman like you, he means a city woman, a widow woman, doesn't belong on a working ranch, and it's only a matter of time before you figure that out." He paused. "Says Jake's going soft, taking in strays." She was quiet for a moment. The water was getting cold. "Is this something the other men agree with?" she asked. "No," Garrett said. "But Deke's been here 11 years. That carries weight whether it should or not." She pulled her hands out of the water and dried them. "Thank you, Garrett." He nodded once and left. That was the whole of it, 4 sentences, which for Garrett was essentially a speech. She thought about it through the rest of the cleaning. She thought about it in her room that night. She thought about what a woman in her position, a woman with nothing to fall back on, in a place where she had no history and no standing except what she built from scratch, could reasonably do. She could go to Jake. She rejected that almost immediately. She had not traveled 900 miles to ask a man to handle her problems. She could confront Deke directly. She thought about that longer. The problem with direct confrontation was that it required the other person to be capable of shame, and men like Deke, in her experience, had spent considerable effort making themselves shame-resistant. She could do nothing and let the work speak for itself. That was the option she kept coming back to. Not because it was passive, she had never been passive in her life, but because it was the only answer that didn't hand Deke the power to define the terms of the conflict. She would do nothing. She would do the job better than anyone could argue with. But she would not pretend she didn't know. The next morning, she made apple pie. Not for dessert, for breakfast, alongside the eggs and salt, pork, a full pie that she cut into 15 equal pieces and put on the table without comment, as if this were a completely normal occurrence, which it was not. There was a silence when they saw it. Then Tommy said, "Is that apple pie?" she confirmed. "Eat your eggs first." The eggs disappeared with record speed. When she brought the pie slices to the table, she served everyone in order. When she got to Deke, she set his piece in front of him with exactly the same care she gave everyone else's. She looked at him when she did it, not long, not meaningfully. Just the natural look of someone making sure the plate had landed correctly. He looked at the pie. He looked at her. He said nothing. She went back to the kitchen. She heard the sounds of 15 men eating pie at 7 in the morning, and she heard underneath it the particular sound of a room that had collectively decided not to take sides, which was not a victory, but was also not a defeat. Later, when she was clearing the table, Hector stopped beside her. Hector was not a man who said things without meaning them. Clara had told her that in the first week, and she'd found it to be accurate. "Good pie," he said. "Thank you." "Good morning for pie," he said. He picked up 2 plates to carry them to the kitchen. He didn't usually do that. Makes people remember that somebody went to the trouble. She looked at him. He looked back with the expression of a man who has said exactly what he meant and doesn't need to repeat it. "Thank you, Hector," she said. He nodded and carried the plates through. She thought, this is how you fight that kind of war. Not with words. with pie at 7 in the morning and a foreman who carries plates. So, 2 days later the stove broke. Not the temperamental and fixable kind of broke she'd gotten used to. The damper mechanism seized completely, and the draw reversed, and she stood in the kitchen at 5:30 in the morning with smoke going the wrong direction, and breakfast supposed to be on the table in 90 minutes, and 15 men who were going to be coming through the door expecting to eat. She assessed the situation for approximately 45 seconds. Then she went and knocked on Jake's door. She had not done this before. She stood in the hallway and knocked twice, and he answered faster than she expected, already dressed because she would learn later he was always up by 4:30. He took one look at her expression and said, "What's wrong?" "The stove damper has seized. I can't cook on it. I need to know if there's another option, or if you have tools I can try." He was already moving past her toward the kitchen. She followed. He looked at the stove, looked at the smoke situation. Put his hand near the damper mechanism. "I've got a toolkit in the barn," he said. "Give me 10 minutes. "I have 70 minutes, she said. "Make it 5. He looked at her. Then he went. He came back in 4 minutes with a leather roll of tools. He worked on the damper while she watched, and she did not stand back and wait. She stood beside him close enough to see what he was doing, because she was going to have to understand this if it happened again. "Hand me the narrow one," he said without looking up. She looked at the tools, found the narrow one, handed it. "You're watching." "I'm learning," she said. "You don't have to learn this. I can fix it when it goes wrong." "You're not always in the barn," she said. "Hand me that back, I want to try it." He paused, looked at her, handed the tool back. "Turn it left," he said. "Not hard feel for the resistance." She turned it, felt the resistance. "Like this. A little more. There, stop." He reached over and held the mechanism while she turned. Their hands were very close together. Neither of them mentioned it. "Now pull it toward you while you turn." She did. Something shifted. The draw changed, reversed caught. The smoke began moving the right direction. "There," Jake said. She held very still for a moment, her hand still on the mechanism, feeling the draw of proper airflow. Then she stepped back and said, "I need you to show me how to prevent it." "Routine is oil on the mechanism every 2 weeks. I should have done it. That's my failure, not yours." "Split the failure," she said. "I should have asked how to maintain it." He looked at her with that contained expression, and she was beginning to know it well enough now to read what was underneath it, which was something that looked very much like respect. "Split the failure," he said. "All right." She turned to the range. "I have 65 minutes. Go. I'll handle it from here." She heard him hesitate not long, just a beat, and then he left. She made eggs scrambled with dried onion hash with yesterday's potatoes and coffee, so strong it constituted its own food group, and she had it on the table with 3 minutes to spare. Tommy came in and looked at her face and said, "Rough morning." "Excellent morning," she said. "Sit down." He sat. He looked at the food. He looked at her. "You've got soot on your collar," he said. "I fought the stove and won," she said. "That earns a little soot." He grinned. The man beside him, a young Mexican hand named Luis, who was quiet in the way of someone still deciding whether a place was safe, looked between them, and for the first time in Margaret's memory, smiled at the table. That was worth any amount of soot. The twist came on the 18th day, and it came from a direction she hadn't been watching. A rider came in from town mid-afternoon, and she heard him talking to Jake near the barn, but she was in the kitchen, and it was none of her business, and she had bread rising that required attention. She thought nothing of it. Then Clara came in, which was unusual, because Clara respected the kitchen as Margaret's territory now, and sat down at the work table with the expression of a woman carrying information she isn't sure how to deliver. "Clara," Margaret said without stopping her work. "Whatever it is, just say it." "There's a man in town," Clara said. "He came in on the noon stage. He's been asking questions about Jake." Margaret looked up. "What kind of questions?" "About the ranch, the deed, whether Jake is the rightful holder." Clara folded her hands on the table. His name is Braddock. Howard Braddock. He's a land agent. Margaret was quiet. Does Jake know he's in town? That's what the rider came to tell him. And Clara looked at her directly. Jake's face when he heard the name Margaret. I've known that man for 7 years, and I have never seen him look like that. She paused. Like he'd known something like this was coming and had been waiting for it anyway. Margaret set down the bread she was working. What do you know about it? Only what Hector's told me, and Hector doesn't know everything. Clara lowered her voice as if someone might be listening. 3 years ago, Jake had a partner, man named Victor Cross. They built this ranch together, or that was the arrangement. Jake did the work, Cross provided the capital, and the deed was held in both names. Then Cross died, and his estate started making claims about what was owed, and Jake spent the better part of a year fighting it off in Abilene. He won. Or he thought he won. Margaret felt something cold move through her. Braddock. Works for Cross's son, Clara said, who has apparently decided to try again. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, they could hear Jake's voice too far to make out words, but the tone was controlled in the particular way of a man controlling something with effort. How bad could it be? Margaret asked. Clara looked at her with the honest eyes of a woman who didn't trade in false comfort. If someone's challenging the deed and has any kind of legal standing, he could lose everything. The land, the cattle, the house. She paused. All of us. Margaret thought of 15 men who came to a table every morning expecting breakfast. She thought of Tommy, who was 18 years old and had nowhere else. She thought of Garrett, who never said anything, and Luis, who was finally starting to smile. She thought of the kitchen, her kitchen now, whether she'd meant it to be or not. She thought no. Not a loud no. Not a dramatic no. Just the quiet, absolute, deeply practical no of a woman who has lost everything she had once and knows precisely how it feels and is not prepared to watch it happen to someone else without doing something about it. What do we know about the legal situation? She said. Almost nothing. Jake doesn't talk about it. Does Jake have a lawyer? He did, in Abilene. I don't know if that's still the arrangement. Does he have the paperwork? The original deed, the settlement from 3 years ago? Clara blinked. I would assume so. He's not a careless man. No, Margaret said. He isn't. She was already thinking, her mind moving in directions she'd kept closed off for months. The directions that had made her useful in Philadelphia before everything collapsed. The ability to look at a legal or financial problem and see the shape of it. Edward had always dismissed that ability. You don't need to understand it, Maggie, that's what lawyers are for. She had believed him. She would not make that mistake again. I need to talk to him. Margaret. I know, she said. It's not my business. That's not what I was going to say. Clara looked at her steadily. I was going to say, be careful how you do it. He doesn't take help well. He'll see it as pity before he sees it as help, and if he thinks you pity him, he'll close up entirely. Margaret thought about that, about a man who read Whitman in an empty kitchen and kept his dead wife's books in a pantry and had spent 4 years running a ranch with a grief he never mentioned. A man who asked for laughter because he didn't know how to ask for anything else. I know how to talk to a man who doesn't want to be talked to, she said. Clara looked at her for a long moment. Yes, she said quietly. I believe you do, Sha. She found him after supper in the predictable place, the porch. She brought 2 cups of coffee and sat on the step the way she had before, at an angle not beside him, but within the same conversation. She handed him a cup. He took it. She said nothing for a while. Let the quiet do its work. Then, Clara told me about Braddock. His jaw tightened. She watched it. Clara talks too much. Clara loves this ranch, Margaret said. That's why she told me. He was quiet. How serious is it? She asked. I don't know yet. But you have a sense. His hands wrapped around the cup. Victor Cross's boy has been building a case for 2 years. He's got money, and he's got lawyers, and he's got patience. The words came out measured the way you measure out something finite. I got the deed cleared in 62. I thought that was settled. Apparently his lawyers found a clause in the original partnership agreement they're claiming. Something about right of succession. Have you seen the document they're citing? He looked at her. Not yet. You need to see it, she said. Before anything else. Before you talk to a lawyer, before you respond to anything Braddock does, you need to see the specific language they're claiming gives them standing. He was watching her carefully. You know about legal documents. I know about documents, she said. When my husband's debts came due, I spent 4 months reading every contract, every agreement, every note he'd signed in 19 years. I didn't have a lawyer at first, I couldn't afford one, so I had to learn to read the documents myself. She paused. I got fairly good at it. He was quiet for a long moment. Did it help? In the end, no, she said. The debts were real. But I understood what was real and what was posturing, which is worth something. Creditors depend on you not knowing the difference. He turned the cup in his hands. She could see him deciding something. The partnership agreement is in my office, he said. In the bottom drawer of the desk. The settlement from 62 is with it. She looked at him. You're showing me where it is. You said you can read documents. I can. Then read them. His voice was even, but something underneath it wasn't. Tell me what they're going to use against me. She held his gaze. All right. This doesn't leave the house, he said. Of course not. He nodded once, drank his coffee, looked out at the dark. After a moment, he said quietly, as if he was saying it to himself as much as to her, I built this ranch from nothing. Not from Cross's money, his money got us started, but everything after that was 15-hour days, and bad winters, and cattle drives that almost broke us twice. If they take it, they won't, she said. He looked at her. You don't know that. No, she said. But I know that a man who fought this off once knows how to fight it off again, and I know that now you have someone who can read the documents and tell you exactly where the weak points are. She met his eyes directly. You're not alone in this kitchen, Jake. And you're not alone in this either. The silence that followed was the longest one they'd had, the kind that doesn't feel like absence, feels like something filling up. You came here to cook, he said finally. I came here to survive, she said. Those are different things. She stood, picked up her cup. I'll look at the documents tonight. I'll tell you what I find in the morning before the men are up. She went inside. In the hallway she stopped, pressed one hand flat against the wall, and breathed. She had not meant to get this involved. She had come here for a room and a purpose, and nothing more complicated than that. She had meant to cook breakfast and wash pots and not build anything that could be taken from her again. But 15 men came to that table every morning, and one of them sat at the head of it and kept his dead wife's poetry in the pantry and had just handed her the drawer that held everything he had. She had no choice. She never really had. She went to the office. She found the drawer. She lit the lamp and sat down with the documents and began to read. She read for 3 hours. The partnership agreement was 12 pages hand-drafted in the kind of language that looks plain but means something specific in every clause. The settlement document from 62 was another 8 pages plus 2 pages of exhibits. She read everything twice, made notes on the back of an envelope she found in the drawer, and by the time the lamp started running low, she had a clear picture of the situation. It was not as bad as it could have been. It was also not simple. The clause Cross's lawyers were apparently citing gave the surviving partner's estate the right to demand a review of asset distribution in the event of a dissolution of the partnership. But the 62 settlement had included a specific waiver of that right, signed by the executor of Cross's estate. The question was whether the executor had legal standing to sign that waiver, given that Cross's son had been a minor at the time and could arguably claim his interests had not been properly represented. That was the wedge they were trying to use. It was thin. But thin wedges in experienced hands could split things wide open. She sat back and looked at her notes. The answer, if there was one, was in the executor's standing. If the executor had been properly appointed and had proper authority, the waiver held, and the case was weaker than it looked. If there was any question about the appointment, it got complicated. She needed to know about the executor. That was the thread to pull. She closed the documents, stacked them carefully, put them back in the drawer exactly as she'd found them, put the envelope of notes in her apron pocket. She went to bed at 11:30. She lay in the dark and thought about a man on his own porch who had just handed her the drawer with everything in it. Not because he trusted easily, she understood already that he did not, but because he was a man who, when he had to make a decision, made it completely. And he had decided somewhere between coffee and the dark that she was someone he could hand the drawer to. She thought, be careful, Margaret. And then she thought, it's already too late for that. She was careful about a great many things. She had not been careful about this ranch, or this kitchen, or these 15 men who came to her table every morning and left slightly more human than they arrived. She had not been careful, and she was not sorry. She closed her eyes and slept without dreaming for the first time in months. In the morning she was up before 4. She had the coffee on and her notes organized on the work table when she heard his boots in the hall earlier than usual, which told her he hadn't slept well either. He came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw her there, lamp on notes laid out, coffee waiting. He poured a cup, sat across the work table from her. "What did you find?" he said. She told him. All of it, the clause, the waiver, the executor question. She told him plainly, without softening it, because she had learned that men who do not want pity also do not want false comfort, and Jake Caldwell specifically would rather hear a hard truth than a gentle lie. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. The executor was a man named Pierce, he said. James Pierce. He was Cross's lawyer and his appointed executor. It was in Cross's will, which was filed and probated in Abilene. Then his standing was proper, she said. The waiver should hold. Should. Yes, she said. Should. The question is whether Cross's lawyers can argue that a minor's interests were inadequately represented regardless of the executor's standing. It's a weaker argument, but it's not impossible. She looked at him directly. You need your Abilene lawyer. You need him to pull the probate record for Cross's will and confirm the executor appointment, and you need that in hand before Braddock makes any formal move. Jake looked at her for a long moment. She held the look without flinching. Why are you doing this? He said. She thought about several answers. Chose the true one. Because this ranch is full of people who need it to stay standing, she said. And because someone needs to be the person who reads the documents, and apparently that's me. He looked at her, that contained look, but beneath it something that was very close to undone. Margaret, he said. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She felt it land. Write to your lawyer today, she said. I'll have breakfast ready in an hour. She turned back to the range. Behind her she heard him stand. She heard the sound of him picking up his cup. She heard him stop in the kitchen doorway. Thank you, he said. His voice was low, and it held something in it that neither of them would name yet, but that sat in the kitchen between the lamp and the coffee pot, and the notes on the back of an envelope, like a thing that had always been there waiting for them to notice. She kept her eyes on the range. Go write the letter, she said. He went. She stood at the stove and felt the early morning quiet of the kitchen settle around her, the familiar sounds of the fire, the smell of coffee, the particular darkness before dawn that she had come to think of as hers and no one else's. She thought $12.40. 2 bags, a newspaper advertisement. She thought about everything she had lost and everything she had not expected to find. Outside, the dark was already beginning to thin at the edges. In an hour, the men would come in from the bunkhouse, cold and hungry, and counting on her. The stove was behaving. The coffee was ready. Whatever was coming with Braddock, whatever thread she had just picked up and begun to pull, that was for later. For now, there was this, a kitchen that needed her, a day that was starting, and the particular hard-won piece of a woman who had found her footing in the last place she'd expected. She picked up the spatula and got to work. Jake's letter to Abilene went out on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Margaret had stopped waiting for a fast answer and started preparing for the possibility that the answer, when it came, would not be good. She did not share this with anyone. She folded it into the back of her mind, the way you fold a bill you can't yet pay. Present accounted for, not forgotten, and she kept the kitchen running with the discipline of a woman who understands that the best thing you can do when something large and uncertain is bearing down on you is to control every small thing within your reach. The bread came out right every morning. The coffee stayed hot. The meals arrived on time. But the ranch felt different now. She felt it in the way men came to the table a little quieter, a little more careful with their words, the way people get when they know something is wrong but haven't been told officially, and so are carrying the weight of not knowing without anywhere to put it down. Hector knew. Clara had told him, and Hector carried it the way he carried everything steady upright, without burdening anyone else with the effort it cost him. He worked longer hours. He pushed the younger men harder, not cruelly, but with the focused urgency of someone who knows that a ranch under threat needs to look unassailable from the outside. Tommy didn't know the specifics, but Tommy was 19 and perceptive in the unguarded way of people who haven't yet learned to stop paying attention. He came into the kitchen on Friday morning and sat at the table and watched Margaret work with an expression she recognized, the expression of someone trying to figure out whether they're allowed to ask. "Ask?" she said without turning around. "Is Jake in trouble?" She considered how to answer that. She settled on what she would have wanted someone to tell her back when she'd been the one without information in a situation that concerned her. The truth partial, but not dishonest. "There's a legal challenge to the ranch deed," she said. "It came up before 3 years ago and Jake handled it. He's handling it again." "How bad is it?" "It's manageable," she said, "if the right information comes from Abilene in time." Tommy was quiet. Then, "What do we do?" She turned to look at him. Then, because the question surprised her, not its content but its pronoun. "We." As if it were obvious that this was a shared problem. "You do what you do every day," she said. "You work, you show up, you eat your breakfast, and you don't give Braddock or anyone he's working with a single reason to think this ranch is anything other than solid." He nodded slowly. "My dad used to say when things got bad, you don't let it show on the outside. You keep doing the work." "Your dad was right," she said. Tommy nodded again, picked up his coffee, and drank it with the resolved expression of a boy deciding to be a man about something. She watched him do it, and felt the particular ache of recognizing courage in someone young enough that it still costs them something to find it. She turned back to the range. The biscuits needed another 4 minutes. She thought, hold together. Just a little longer. Braddock came to the ranch on Saturday. She heard the horse before she heard the knock, a single horse moving at the careful pace of someone who wants to be seen arriving, rather than surprised arriving. She was in the kitchen when Hector came through the back door and said quietly, "Man at the front. Says he's here to see Jake." "Braddock. Says his name is Howard Braddock, land agent. Has a document case with him." She dried her hands. "Where's Jake?" "Still out, south pasture. I sent Luis for him, he'll be 20 minutes. 20 minutes. She looked at Hector. He looked at her. "I'll go," she said. "Margaret." "I'll go," she said again. "I'm not going to negotiate with him. I'm going to make sure he waits, and I'm going to watch him while he does." Hector looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man deciding whether to argue and concluding it wouldn't accomplish anything. She went to the front of the house. Howard Braddock was somewhere past 45 with a lawyer's hands and a land agent's eyes, the kind that are always measuring, always pricing, always looking for the gap between what something is worth and what the person holding it knows it's worth. He was dressed for town in a way that looked deliberately out of place, and he held his document case with the practiced ease of someone who uses it as both tool and prop. He looked at Margaret with the very slight recalibration of a man who had expected to deal with a rancher and instead found a woman in an apron. "Mrs.," he said. "Sullivan," she said. "Margaret Sullivan. I manage the household at Circle M." She kept her voice even, and her posture exact. "Mr. Caldwell is on the south pasture and will be back within the half hour. I'd invite you to wait." Braddock's eyes moved over her with the quick assessment of a man deciding what category she fit. "You're the cook." "I manage the household," she said again precisely. "Coffee." He accepted. She brought it to the front room and sat across from him, not beside him, not deferentially, but with the measured distance of someone conducting a conversation they intend to control. She did not ask about his business. She talked about the weather, the quality of the road from town, whether the stage from Abilene was running on schedule. She talked about nothing pleasantly with the fluency of a woman who had spent 20 years in Philadelphia society rooms, where the ability to make empty conversation was both currency and armor. Braddock, she noticed, was not good at empty conversation. He kept trying to steer toward substance, and she kept redirecting smoothly, without appearing to redirect, and she watched him grow incrementally more frustrated in the particular way of men who are used to being the most prepared person in a room. She was also watching his document case. She was watching where his eyes went when she said Jake's name. She was watching the specific quality of his confidence high, but with something underneath it that wasn't entirely settled. That mattered. Fully settled confidence doesn't show anything. The fact that she could see something underneath Braddock's told her what she'd suspected: the case was not as solid as he wanted Jake to believe. Jake came through the door at the 22-minute mark, still in his work clothes, with the controlled expression he used when he needed to manage a situation without letting it manage him. He looked at Margaret first, a quick questioning look, and she gave him the smallest nod she could make legible. "I have information. You're all right, proceed." He looked at Braddock. "Mr. Braddock." "Mr. Caldwell." Braddock set his coffee down, picked up his document case with the movement of a man shifting into professional mode. "I appreciate you seeing me." "You didn't give me much choice," Jake said. "Sit down." Margaret stood. "I'll leave you." "Stay," Jake said. Braddock looked between them. "This is a legal matter, Mr. Caldwell. Perhaps—" "Mrs. Sullivan manages my household and has my confidence," Jake said. "She stays." There was a pause. Braddock reassessed. She watched him do it, watched him decide that making an issue of her presence would cost him more than it gained, and settle. "As you wish," he said. He opened the document case. What Braddock laid out over the next 40 minutes was, as Margaret had suspected, built on the executor question. He had documentation, a legal brief prepared by the firm representing Cross's son, citing precedent from 2 territorial court cases, and arguing that the executor's waiver had been signed without proper consideration of the minor's future interests. It was well constructed. She had to give his lawyers that. They had found the thinnest possible thread in the 62 settlement, and had pulled it until it looked like more than a thread. She sat and listened and did not speak. She watched Jake listen, watched the way he held himself through it absolutely still. The way a man holds still when he knows that any movement might betray how much he cares. His hands were flat on his thighs. His jaw was level. When Braddock finished, he put a document on the table. Cross's estate is prepared to offer a settlement. Mr. Caldwell retains operational control of the ranch and 60% of the assessed land value in exchange for a release of the deed claim. Jake looked at the document, did not touch it. "You're asking me to give up 40% of my land," he said. "Land I built and paid for and legally settled 3 years ago." The estate believes wrong," Jake said. His voice was very quiet, very level. Margaret had heard enough of his voices now to know that this was the dangerous one. "I'm not signing anything, and I'd like you to leave my property." Braddock's composure held, but only barely. "Mr. Caldwell, if this goes to court—" "Then it goes to court," Jake said. He stood. "I've done it before." Braddock stood also. He picked up his document case with the movements of a man recalculating. "The offer has a deadline," he said. 2 weeks. After that, the estate files formally, and the process becomes considerably more expensive," Jake said. "For everyone. Yes, I know how this works. He walked to the door and opened it. Good day, Mr. Braddock. Braddock looked at Margaret, a quick, sharp look, as if she might be the more reasonable party. She looked back at him with the pleasantly blank expression she had cultivated over 2 decades of Philadelphia social occasions, which communicated nothing except that she was entirely comfortable with the current situation. He left. Jake closed the door. The sound of the horse moving away filled the silence. Then he sat back down. He put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, and stayed like that for exactly long enough that Margaret understood he needed a moment and did not fill it. When he looked up, he said, "Tell me what you saw." She sat forward. His lawyers built it well, but not well enough. The executor argument is their whole case. There's nothing else holding it up. If you can get confirmation from your Abilene lawyer that Pierce's appointment was formally probated and that the waiver was executed within the proper scope of his authority, the brief falls apart. She paused. But Jake, 2 weeks is not much time. I know. Has your lawyer responded? Not yet. Write again today. Tell him 2 weeks. Tell him you need the probate record for Cross's will and Pierce's appointment documentation specifically. She held his gaze. And tell him that if he can't produce it in 10 days, you need to find someone who can. He looked at her for a long moment. You understand, you don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said. I'm choosing to. Why? She thought about it. She thought about the right answer and the true answer, and whether they were the same thing. Because I spent 19 years in a house where I wasn't allowed to use what I knew, she said, and I'm not interested in going back to that. He held her gaze. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't fully read. Gratitude, yes, but also something that was almost painful, as if what she'd said had landed somewhere close to a wound. All right, he said quietly. Write the letter, she said. I have to get back to the kitchen. Lunch is in 40 minutes. She stood. He stood. They were closer than they usually stood. The conversation had drawn them both forward without either of them noting it, and for a moment neither of them moved back. Then she said, You held your ground well in there. You kept him talking for 20 minutes before I got here, he said. That was holding ground. She picked up her apron from the chair where she'd set it. That wasn't strategy, she said. I genuinely wanted to know if the stage from Abilene was running on time. He laughed. She had not heard him laugh before, not a real one, full and unguarded, and it hit her like something physical, the sound of it, the way it changed his face entirely. She went back to the kitchen before her own expression could do anything she'd have to explain. The letter to Abilene went out that afternoon, marked urgent. Margaret wrote it herself. Jake dictated she wrote because her handwriting was clearer and her legal phrasing more precise, and they both understood this without having to say so. When it was done, he read it over and said, This is better than what I would have written. You would have written something like the situation is urgent and your assistance is required, she said. Lawyers respond to specificity. I told him exactly what documents you need and exactly why and exactly what timeline you're working with. You've dealt with lawyers before. More than I ever wanted to, she said. After Edward, she stopped. He waited. When the creditors came, she said more quietly, some of them sent lawyers. I had to learn to read what they put in front of me, because if I didn't understand it, I signed it, and if I signed it without understanding it, I lost more. She set the pen down. I lost a great deal regardless, but I lost less than I might have. I'm sorry, he said, for what he put you through. She looked at him. I'm not sorry, she said. Not anymore. She searched for the right word. I'm informed. That's what it made me. And informed turns out to be useful. He looked at her with that look, the one she'd stopped trying to classify, because it didn't fit any category she had a name for. Yes, he said. It does. The answer came from Deke that evening, and it came in the worst possible form. She was at the sink when she heard the voices outside the kitchen window, not raised, not confrontational, but with the particular quality of men who have been drinking enough to say what they'd normally hold back. Deke's voice. And another one she placed after a moment as belonging to a man named Croft, who'd been at the ranch 8 months and who had the quality of a person who finds it natural to agree with whoever seems most certain. Telling you it's a matter of time, Deke was saying. Ranch can't survive a court fight. Jake knows it. That's why he's desperate enough to let a widow woman from back east run his affairs. She went still. She's just the cook, Croft said. Is she? Deke's voice had something ugly in it. She was alone with him in the front room for 20 minutes with that land agent. She wrote his letter to Abilene. She's got her hooks in this situation a lot deeper than a cook ought to. A pause. Women like her, they come out here with nothing, and they find a man with something, and they don't let go until they've got what they came for. She stood at the sink with her hands in the water and felt something move through her that was cold and precise and very, very old. She had heard versions of this before in Philadelphia, drawing rooms from Edward's creditors, from women who had once called her friend. The particular cruelty of being reduced to a motive when you had actual substance. She could go outside and say something. She could say nothing and let it pass. She could tell Jake. She chose a fourth option. She finished the dishes. She went to the front room. She found Jake in his office working on the ranch accounts. She knocked on the open door and he looked up. Deke is outside the kitchen window, she said, telling Croft that I have my hooks in you and that I came here to get my hands on the ranch. She watched his face. It went very still. Then something moved through it that was quiet and absolute and not pleasant. How long has he been talking like this? Jake said. Garrett told me 2 weeks ago he was saying I wouldn't last, she said. Tonight is the first time I've heard the rest of it personally. Jake set down his pen. Jake. She kept her voice even. I need you to understand something before you do anything. If you go out there and confront him because of what he said about me, it looks like he's right. It looks like I've got a claim on you that's something other than employment, and that gives his words more weight than they deserve. He looked at her steadily. What he said is wrong, she said. I know it's wrong. You know it's wrong. The question is how you handle it, because how you handle it determines whether people believe it. He was quiet for a long moment. What would you have me do? Nothing tonight, she said. Let it go tonight. If he says it again, if it goes further, then you address it. But you address it about the work, not about me. You tell him that a man who speaks about another employee, the way he spoke about me, is a man who's looking for a reason to leave. He's been here 11 years. I know, she said. That's why you say it quietly and only once. Jake looked at her for a long time. She held the look without flinching the way she'd learned to hold difficult things without letting them push her off her feet. You should be angry, he said finally. I am angry, she said. I'm furious, actually. But I've learned that fury is more useful when it's pointed in the right direction. She paused. And right now, the right direction is Abilene, and your deed not Deke Harlan's opinion of me. Something shifted in his face. Something that was very close to awe, or the specific kind of respect that comes from watching someone handle something hard in a way you couldn't have managed yourself. All right, he said quietly. Good. She stepped back from the doorway. I'm going to bed. The letter's on your desk. It'll go with the morning writer. Margaret. She stopped. What he said. Jake's voice was careful, precise. I want you to know whatever my men might think, whatever Braddock or anyone else might think, I know exactly why you're here, and it's got nothing to do with what Deke said. She stood in the doorway and looked at him, and thought, you have no idea how much that costs you to say, and how much it costs me to hear it. Thank you, she said. She went to bed. She lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the ranch settle into night, and she thought about hooks, about what it meant to have them, and what it meant to deny them, and what it meant when the distinction stopped being entirely clear. She thought, be careful, Margaret. And then she thought it has been too late for careful for quite some time now. The response from Abilene came on the 9th day one day, before she'd told herself to start genuinely worrying. It came in the form of a letter and a separate packet of documents, and Jake brought them to the kitchen without opening them, which told her something about what kind of news he was bracing for. She wiped her hands. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She opened the letter. She read it once quickly, and then again slowly, and then she set it down and looked at the packet of documents and opened those and read the relevant sections. Jake watched her face. She kept it level. She had learned from Edward's creditors, from Philadelphia lawyers, from every moment she'd had to receive bad news in front of people who were waiting to see what it would do to her, how to receive information without broadcasting a reaction before she'd had time to think about what the reaction should be. She put the documents down. She looked at Jake. James Pierce was appointed executor by Cross's will, which was filed and probated in Abilene in September of 1859, she said. Your lawyer has the probate record. Pierce's authority to execute the waiver fell entirely within the scope of his appointment as executor. She paused. Cross's son was 16 when the estate settled, not a minor under Kansas territorial law, which sets majority at 16 for purposes of estate proceedings. Jake stared at her. Their case falls apart, she said. The executor had full standing. The waiver is valid. Cross's son is 34 years old, and he had full legal standing at 16, and his lawyer should have known this, or they did know it and decided to try anyway. She pushed the documents toward him. You're not in danger of losing this ranch, Jake. He looked at the documents. He looked at her. He put both hands flat on the work table, and for a moment, he did not move at all. She watched him absorb it, watched the weight of 2 weeks of controlled worry begin to release from somewhere in his chest, and she watched him hold very still while it did, because he was a man who did not know how to receive relief any more easily than he received help. You're sure, he said. Read the probate record, she said. Your lawyer flagged the specific section. Page 3, the clause establishing the scope of the executor's authority over all estate assets and obligations. She had memorized it. It's clear. He pulled the documents toward him and read. She got up and poured 2 cups of coffee, because something in the moment required something to do with her hands. When he looked up, his eyes were different. She had seen him worried, or rather she had seen him containing worry, which was the version he allowed to show, and she had seen him controlled and guarded, and once on the porch in the dark, something that was nearly grief. But she had not seen him the way he looked right now, which was a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and had just been told he could set it down. Margaret, he said. She put his coffee in front of him. Write to your lawyer. Tell him to respond to Braddock's firm formally citing the probate record and the scope of the executor's authority. Do it in the next 3 days before the 2-week deadline Braddock set. I will. He didn't pick up the coffee. He was looking at her. What you've done over the past 2 weeks. I read documents, she said. That's all. That's not all, he said, and his voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Not the careful, contained version. Something underneath that. I've had lawyers, and I've had Hector, and I've had 15 good men on this ranch, and none of them did what you did. None of them sat down with those documents at 11 o'clock at night and came back in the morning with an answer. He paused. None of them kept Braddock talking for 20 minutes, so I'd have time to get back. None of them. He stopped. Jake. You've been here less than a month, he said. And I cannot imagine this place without you. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, the ranch was going about its business. She could hear Tommy somewhere near the barn, and the distant sound of cattle, and the ordinary sounds of a place that was going to remain standing. She looked at Jake Caldwell, who was sitting at her kitchen table, holding a cup of coffee, and telling her the truest thing he knew how to say, which was not a romantic declaration, but was something more fundamental than that, the declaration of a man who has been alone a long time, telling you that you have changed the shape of that aloneness. I'm not going anywhere, she said, quietly, steadily. He nodded. Once, she sat back down across from him. Drink your coffee, she said. "And then go tell Hector. He's been worried." He drank his coffee. He stood. He paused at the kitchen door. "Tonight," he said, "I'm going to read something, on the porch, if you want to." He stopped, started again. "The Whitman. I think I'm ready to read it again." She looked at him. She thought about a man who had kept his wife's poetry in a pantry for 4 years because he couldn't read it and couldn't bring himself to let it go. "I'll bring the coffee out at 8, she said. He nodded. Left. She sat in the kitchen alone for 1 full minute, listening to the sound of a ranch that was going to be all right, and she allowed herself just this once, just for 60 seconds, to feel the full weight of what that meant. Not just for Jake. For all of them. For the woman who had arrived with $12.40 and 2 bags, and the only real currency she'd had the willingness to show up and not break. She thought, "I am still here." She thought that is everything. She got up, washed the cups, and started on lunch, because 15 men were going to be hungry in 2 hours, and the work did not pause for anything. Not for relief, not for loss, not for the particular quiet joy of a morning when something that had been broken began at last to hold. At 8 o'clock, she carried 2 cups of coffee to the porch. Jake was sitting with the Whitman open in his hands, not reading yet, just holding it the way you hold something before you're ready to begin. She set his cup beside him and sat on the step. He opened the book. He read not aloud just to himself, but she could see him reading, could see the movement of it in the set of his shoulders. After a while, he said without looking up, "She used to read this one out loud." "Which one?" He read her the title. She recognized it, one of the longer ones about grass, about what it means to keep growing. "She had a good reading voice," Margaret asked. "She had a voice that made you feel like the words were for you personally," he said. Like Whitman had written them, knowing she'd be the one to read them. He was quiet for a moment. "I used to think that was just her, that the words needed her to be that way." He looked up from the book. "I'm starting to think the words were always like that. I just needed to be ready to hear them again." Margaret held her cup in both hands and looked out at the dark. "That's what grief does when it's done with you," she said. "It gives things back. Differently, but back." "Is it done with you?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "But I think it's moving on, finding other rooms to occupy." She paused, leaving this one a little clearer. He nodded. He looked back at the book. He read another line quietly, just to the night air, just to the space between them, and she listened and didn't say anything, and the silence between them was the best kind, the kind that doesn't need filling because it's already full. At 9 o'clock, she took the cups inside and went to bed. She lay in the dark and thought that she had not expected when she stepped off that stage in Willow Creek with $12.40 to find anything except survival. She had not expected 15 men who needed her. She had not expected a stove that required patience and understanding, which were the things she'd always had the most of and the least chance to use. She had not expected a man who kept poetry in a pantry and laughed when she least expected it and had handed her the drawer with everything in it. She had been careful her whole life. She had been careful, and it had not protected her. She was finished with careful. She closed her eyes. Outside on the porch, she heard the quiet sound of a man reading by lamplight alone, but no longer lonely on the ranch that was going to stay his, because she had read the documents, because she had been informed, because she had not broken. The Kansas night settled around Circle M Ranch, the way it always did, vast and indifferent, and somehow tonight not unkind. And Margaret Sullivan, who had arrived with nothing but the nerve to stay, slept without dreaming, and woke ready. Braddock's formal withdrawal came on a Wednesday, delivered by Ryder from town, in a sealed envelope that Jake opened at the kitchen table, while Margaret stood at the range pretending to check the bread. He read it twice, set it down, picked up his coffee. "It's done," he said. She did not turn around immediately. She gave herself 3 seconds, counted them, the way she counted everything that mattered now, the way she'd learned to give important things exactly the space they needed before she responded to them. Then she turned. Completely. Their firm is withdrawing the claim. No filing. No further action. He looked at the letter one more time, as if checking that it still said the same thing. Cross's son apparently decided the cost wasn't worth the outcome once our lawyer responded with the probate record. He was always going to decide that, she said. The case was built on the assumption you wouldn't know what to look for. I didn't, Jake said. Not until you. She sat down across from him. You would have found it. Maybe, he said. In time. He looked at her directly. We didn't have time. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she did something she hadn't planned to do. She reached across the table and put her hand briefly over his, the way you do when words are insufficient, and something physical is needed to carry the weight of what you mean. She pulled her hand back before it became something that required acknowledging. He looked at where her hand had been. Then he looked at her. He didn't say anything, which was the right response. Jake Caldwell understood better than almost anyone she'd met that some moments don't need language. Tell Hector, she said. He's been running himself into the ground for 2 weeks trying to look like nothing was wrong. I will. He folded the letter and put it in his pocket. He stood. He paused at the kitchen door with a habit she'd gotten used to that pause that moment before he left a room, as if he was always calculating whether there was something else that needed saying. Margaret, he said. Thank you doesn't cover it. No, she agreed. It doesn't. But it's what we have, so it'll do. He almost smiled. Left. She listened to his boots down the hall and out the front door, and she sat alone in the kitchen for exactly 1 minute, letting herself feel the particular relief of a crisis concluded. Not the loud relief of a near miss, but the quiet, deep relief of a threat that had been faced head-on and turned back. Then Tommy appeared in the doorway, took one look at her face and said, "Good news." "Very good news," she said. He let out a breath that he'd apparently been holding for 2 weeks. "Thank God," he said with a sincerity that was entirely unperformed. "I've been so worried I've been dropping things." "I noticed," she said. "You broke 2 cups." "I'll pay for them." "You absolutely will not." She stood up. "Go tell the others. Jake's telling Hector, but the men deserve to know." She pointed at him. "And Tommy, tell them quietly. No celebration that makes it look like we were afraid. We handled it, that's all." He grinned with his whole face. "Yes, ma'am." He disappeared. She heard him outside. Approximately 30 seconds later, the particular sound of a young man exercising extreme restraint while conveying extremely good news, which meant a sort of aggressive, whispered urgency that carried through the walls regardless. She shook her head. She went back to the bread. The thing about a crisis resolved is that it leaves a space where the crisis used to be, and what fills that space is whatever was waiting behind it. What was waiting behind the Braddock situation, Margaret discovered over the following week, was Deke Harlan. And Deke Harlan had apparently decided now that the external threat was gone to become the internal one. She heard it from Clara first, then from Garrett, and finally saw it directly herself on a Thursday evening when she came through the kitchen door into the yard to get more wood for the box, and found Deke talking to Luis, and 2 of the younger hands with the specific posture of a man making a point he's been rehearsing. She stopped. She couldn't hear the words. But she saw Luis's face, the careful blankness of someone from somewhere else who has learned to make themselves small when something threatening moves through a room, and she saw the 2 younger men looking at their boots, and she saw Deke standing with his weight back and his arms crossed in the manner of a man who has decided he is the authority in a given situation. She picked up the wood. She went back inside. She put the wood in the box. She washed her hands. She stood at the sink for a moment looking at the window. She thought enough. She had been patient. She had played it strategically the way she'd told Jake to play it quietly once about the work. She had given Deke the professional courtesy of not making it personal, which was more than he'd extended her. She had been patient and strategic, and it had not resolved anything. And now he was talking to Luis, who was 22 years old, and 3 years from Mexico, and was just beginning to feel like he had a place at this table, and she was done. She went to Jake's office. He looked up, looked at her face, set down his pen. "Deke," she said. "What did he do?" "He's outside talking to Luis and two of the others. I don't know exactly what he's saying, but I know what it looks like, and I know what it's doing to Luis." She stood in the doorway. "I'm not asking you to fight my battles. I'm telling you that what he's doing now has stopped being about me and has started being about your men, and that's a different matter." Jake was already standing. "I'll handle it," he said. "I know you will," she said. "That's why I came to you." He walked past her into the hall. She went back to the kitchen. She did not follow him outside because this was his, and she'd said what she needed to say, and the rest was his to do. She heard voices outside. She couldn't make out the words, didn't try to. She focused on the bread dough in front of her, on the feel of it under her hands, on the rhythm of the work. 15 minutes later, Tommy came through the back door. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood at the counter with the expression of someone who had witnessed something they were still processing. "What happened?" she said. "Jake talked to Deke," Tommy said. "And?" Tommy wrapped both hands around his cup. "And Deke's leaving. Day after tomorrow. Jake gave him a month's wage and told him—" He paused. "He said a man who uses his years of service as a reason to undermine the people around him has already decided he doesn't want to be here anymore." Margaret kept her hands in the dough. "He said that to him directly, quietly," Tommy said. "But yeah, directly." He looked at her sidelong. "Deke said some things back. About you. About Jake being, he used a word I won't repeat. I can imagine the word." "Jake didn't raise his voice," Tommy said, almost wonderingly. "He just looked at him and said, 'You have 2 days to settle your things.'" Tommy drank his coffee. Luis was still standing there. I think Jake did that on purpose, so Luis would see." She pulled the dough and folded it. "Jake's a smart man." "He's a different man than he was 6 weeks ago," Tommy said. "I don't mean that wrong. I just mean," he searched for words, "he's here more, in the room. You know, before he was always somewhere else in his head, going through the motions of being present." She said nothing, but she felt the words settle somewhere. "I'm just saying." Tommy said, "Whatever you did, it worked." "I cooked breakfast," she said. "Ma'am," Tommy said with the gentle patience of a 19-year-old who has decided to be direct, "you did considerably more than cook breakfast." She looked at him. He looked back with that clear, unguarded gaze. "Go finish your chores," she said. He grinned and went. The storm came without adequate warning, the way the worst ones do. It had been building for 2 days. She'd felt it in the air, that particular heaviness that she'd never known in Philadelphia, but had come to recognize here, the feeling of something large gathering its intention. She'd mentioned it to Hector, and he'd nodded, and said they'd had their eye on it, and she'd accepted that, and made sure there was extra wood in both boxes, and that the pantry was stocked, in case men couldn't get in from the outer pastures. She had not imagined this. It hit at 3 in the morning on a Friday, and it hit the way Great Plains storms hit when they mean business. Not gradually, not with polite warning, but all at once, wind and rain and a cold that had no right to be this savage in the season they were in. She woke to the sound of it and was dressed and in the kitchen in 4 minutes because some instinct she'd developed in the past 6 weeks told her that she was going to be needed. Jake was already into the hallway. He looked at her, that quick read he did of her face checking, assessing. "2 men are out," he said. "Garrett and Pete Yoder. They were checking the east fence line yesterday evening and didn't come back in." The cold that went through her was not from the storm. "How long?" she said. "Hector's been trying to reach them since midnight. He went out an hour ago with Rodrigo." He was already pulling on his coat. "I'm going out." "What do you need from me?" He stopped, looked at her. "The kitchen," he said. "Whatever they come back with, injuries, cold, exhaustion, I need the kitchen ready. Hot water. Whatever you have for—" He gestured vaguely at the category of things that go wrong with people in bad conditions. "Go," she said. "I'll have it." He went. She turned to the range with the particular focus that emergencies produce the narrowing of everything to what is immediately necessary and the setting aside of everything else without ceremony. Hot water first, all the pots she had filled and on the range. She built the fire to the highest safe point, got the stove running at full capacity. She found the medicine kit she'd brought from Philadelphia, the one she'd given Tommy headache remedy from, and went through it with the mental inventory she'd been keeping since she'd arrived, what she had, what she could substitute for what she didn't. Bandages, carbolic acid. She had a small bottle, laudanum very little enough for real pain, needle and thread. She set these out on the work table with the organized calm of a woman who has decided that panic is simply not on the available list of responses. Clara appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl, her face tight. "What do you need?" "Blankets, as many as you can get. Put them near the range to warm." Margaret was already moving. "And wake Tommy, he's young and strong and I might need him in here." Clara disappeared. Tommy appeared 6 minutes later, hair still pressed from the pillow immediately, and fully present in the way of young men who respond well to emergencies. "What do I do?" he said. "Stand there and be ready to do whatever I tell you," she said. "And do it fast." "Yes, ma'am." She kept moving. She made a large pot of the strongest beef broth she could manage from the stock she had. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't a meal, but it was hot and dense with everything a body needed when it had been fighting cold for hours. She made coffee. She heated water in every vessel available. She did not let herself think about Quiet Garrett, who never said more than 4 words, but had come to warn her about Deke, because he'd decided she deserved to know who loved dried apple, anything who she'd been slipping extra cornbread to for 3 weeks, because she'd noticed he always looked at it. She did not let herself think about Pete Yoder, who was 31, and had a photograph of a woman and a child pinned to his bunk above his pillow, which she knew because she'd gone to change his linens the 1 week Clara had been ill, and had seen it, and had not said anything because some things are private. She kept moving, because moving was what she had. They came back at 5:40 in the morning. Hector and Rodrigo first bringing Pete between them. He was upright but wrong. The peculiar wrong of someone whose body has been at the edge of its resources and is now operating on will alone. He was shaking in the deep, uncontrollable way that means the cold has gotten into the muscle. "Here," Margaret said, and she had the blanket ready, warmed by the range, and she wrapped it around him before he'd fully gotten through the door, and she said to Tommy, "Get him to the chair nearest the stove." And Tommy did it with the quiet efficiency of someone doing exactly what they'd been told to do, exactly when they'd been told. Pete sat. She pressed the cup of broth into his hands, made him close both hands around it, and said, "Drink this. All of it. Slowly." He looked at her. His face was the wrong color. "Garrett," he said. "Still out," Hector said behind her. He was in bad shape himself, not as bad as Pete, but the particular gray of exhaustion that comes from fighting cold and fear for hours. "Jake and Rodrigo are still looking." She did not react to this where Pete could see it. She said, "Hector, sit down. Tommy, get him." She pointed at the second warmed blanket. "And there's broth for him, too." She worked the room the way she'd learned to work the kitchen efficiently, with total attention, without wasting motion. Pete's hands were the worst of it. She checked them herself, pressing gently to check circulation, looking at the color, watching how he responded. Not frostbitten, or not yet, which meant they had time if they kept him warm. She kept feeding him broth. She talked to him while she did it, not about Garrett, not about anything frightening, just the ordinary talk of a woman trying to keep a man grounded in the present moment. She talked about breakfast, what she was going to make when the sun came up, whether he had a preference for biscuits or cornbread, a question she already knew the answer to. He answered. That was what mattered, that he was answering. At 6:23, she heard horses. She did not run to the door. She stood very still for 1 second, listening to the sound of it, trying to read what the number of horses meant, what the pace meant. Tommy ran to the door. He looked out. He turned back to her. "Jake." he said. He's got Garrett. She let out a breath she'd been holding for 2 hours. She started moving. Garrett had a broken arm, his left, from a fall when his horse had come down on the wet ground, and he had hypothermia of the serious kind. The kind where the shivering has gone past violent and into something slower and more dangerous. Jake had found him 2 miles from where he should have been, his horse gone lame, sitting against a fence post with the methodical calm of a man who had decided he was going to wait and not panic about it. He came through the door on his own feet, which was more than it looked like he should have been able to manage. Jake was behind him, one hand at his back, and the expression on Jake's face was the one she'd seen only once before. Not controlled, not contained, but exposed in the way people get when they've been genuinely afraid and haven't fully come out of it yet. "Chair," she said. "Closest one." Garrett sat. She assessed him in 60 seconds, breathing color the quality of his responses when she spoke to him, the arm which was clearly broken but was not bleeding. She pulled the warmest blanket she'd kept, one specifically in reserve, and put it around him and said, "Garrett, look at me." He looked at her. His eyes were present, slow and tired and in pain, but present. "You're going to be fine," she said. "The arm needs setting. I'm going to have to do that, and it's going to hurt. But you're here, and you're warm, and you're going to be fine. Do you understand me?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then, in a voice rougher than she'd ever heard from him, "Yes, ma'am." "Good." She turned to Jake. "I can splint the arm. I need straight wood, about 18 inches, 2 pieces. And I need more clean cloth." "I'll get it," Jake said. "And Jake." He stopped. She looked at him directly. "Go change your clothes first. You're soaked through." He looked at her. She looked back. He was cold and exhausted and still running on emergency energy, and she was not going to let him pretend otherwise. 3 minutes, she said. "I'll have what I need ready." He went. He was back in 4 minutes in dry clothes, carrying 2 lengths of smooth wood from the barn. She looked at them, tested them against Garrett's arm to check the length. "Good," she said. "Now hold him." What followed was not pleasant for anyone. Setting a broken arm without a doctor is not a gentle process, and Garrett, who had barely made a sound in 6 weeks at her table, made sounds now that she would remember for a long time, because they were the sounds of a man at the very limit of what he could hold. She worked fast and did not apologize for the pain, because apologizing for necessary pain is a form of dishonesty, and she talked to him the whole time, steady, specific, telling him exactly what she was doing and exactly when the worst of it would be over. Jake held him, and she felt Jake's eyes on her throughout, watching her hands, watching her face. When it was done, she tied the splint and stepped back. Garrett was shaking, but the arm was set. She could feel it, the bones in their right relationship, the splint holding true. "Done," she said. "You did well." He looked at her with the eyes of a man on the other side of something difficult. "Thank you," he said. 2 words from Garrett she had learned were the equivalent of a speech from anyone else. "Thank me by resting," she said. "Tommy, can you and Rodrigo get him set up near the range? He's not going to the bunkhouse tonight." Tommy was already moving. She turned. Jake was standing 2 feet behind her, still watching her. The kitchen was full of people now: Pete, Hector, Rodrigo, Tommy, Clara, who had come back with more blankets, and in the middle of all of it, she and Jake were somehow in a quiet space, a foot of distance between them that felt like both very far and not far enough. "The arm," he said quietly. "Set clean," she said. "He'll need a doctor to confirm when the weather clears, but he's not in danger." "You've done that before." "Once," she said. "My cook in Philadelphia." She fell on the kitchen stairs. She looked at him steadily. "I always had the medicine kit." Edward thought it was excessive. Something moved through Jake's face at the mention of Edward. Not jealousy, nothing so simple as that, but something like the particular kind of anger that comes when you hear about a person who undervalued something you now understand the full value of. "It wasn't excessive," he said. "No," she said. "It wasn't." They stood looking at each other in the middle of a kitchen full of people, and the kitchen around them was warm and loud and alive in the specific way that places get when people have been afraid together and have come out the other side, and something between them was different, not new. She realized that with a slight shock. Not new at all. Just visible, finally. The way things become visible when enough other things have been stripped away. "Margaret," he said. Low. Just her name, but with something in it she'd been hearing for a long time, without letting herself hear it. "I know," she said. Just that. Just those 2 words. He nodded, slowly, like she'd answered a question he hadn't asked out loud. Tommy appeared between them, with the specific obliviousness of the young. "Ma'am, Garrett's asking if there's any apple in anything." "There's apple cake from yesterday," she said without looking away from Jake. "Give him a piece." Tommy disappeared. She took a breath. "I have to feed people," she said. "I know," Jake said. "And you need to sit down and eat something yourself. You've been out in that for 3 hours. Margaret." "Jake." She looked at him directly. "Sit down. I'll feed you. We can—" She stopped. Started again. "We can talk later, when there's space." He looked at her for one long moment. Then he pulled a chair out from the table and sat down with the specific quality of a man who has decided to trust someone enough to let them take care of him, which for a man like Jake Caldwell was not a small thing. She went to the range. She made him eggs and salt pork and bread, and she put it in front of him without ceremony, and she watched from the corner of her eye as he ate with the concentrated attention of a man whose body is insisting on being taken seriously. The kitchen filled and emptied, and filled again over the next 2 hours. Men came in from the bunkhouse, needing to know what had happened. Clara made more coffee. Tommy ferried plates and blankets and managed the whole operation with a competence that had apparently been waiting in him for exactly this kind of moment. By 8 o'clock, the storm was still running but had pulled back from its worst, and Pete was asleep in a chair by the range with color back in his face. And Garrett was asleep on a pallet Clara had made for him with his arm splinted and his expression, even in sleep, somewhat more peaceful than Margaret had ever seen it. She stood at the sink, washing the last of the pots, and she felt it. Then the exhaustion she'd been refusing to acknowledge for 3 hours, dropping through her all at once, the way it does when the crisis is over, and the body realizes it's been holding itself together through will alone. She gripped the edge of the sink. "Hey." Jake's voice behind her, quietly. "Sit down." "I have more to—" "It can wait." He was already beside her, not touching but close. "Sit down, Margaret." She sat. He put coffee in front of her. He sat across from her, and the kitchen was quieter now, and they were as close to alone as they'd been all morning. "You ran this," he said. "From the minute we came in. You had everything ready. You kept Pete from going further into it. You set Garrett's arm." He looked at her steadily. "In 3 years, I've had 3 cooks. None of them." He stopped. "You don't have to—" "I'm not finished," he said. The quiet authority of it, not harsh, just complete, made her stop. None of them would have done any of that. Not because they were bad people, because they came here for a job. He looked at her. "You came here for a job. But somewhere along the line—" He paused. "This became yours, didn't it?" It was not quite a question. She looked around this kitchen. At the range, she'd learned to negotiate with. At the work table, she'd stood at 500 times. At the window over the sink that showed the yard and the barn and the sky that was slowly, grudgingly beginning to lighten. At the 2 men sleeping by her range safe because she'd kept the water hot. "Yes," she said. It did. He looked at her with that expression, the one she'd stopped trying to classify, the one she knew now was what he looked like when he stopped holding everything at a careful distance. "I need to tell you something," he said. She looked at him. "When I wrote that advertisement," he said slowly, "I was looking for a cook. I told myself that was all I needed. The ranch was functional. The men were doing the work. I just needed someone to run the kitchen." He looked at his hands for a moment. "I was lying to myself." She waited. He stopped. Started again. 4 years is a long time to be absent from your own life, he said, going through the motions of it, doing the work and not feeling any of it. And then you came, and you burned the biscuits on day 13, and you laughed at yourself, and you read my legal documents at 11 o'clock at night, and told me the truth in the morning, and you set Garrett's arm at 6 in the morning without being asked, and... His voice had gone lower. I haven't been absent from my own life since about the 3rd week you were here. The kitchen was very quiet. She felt the weight of what he'd said, not its surface, but the depth of it, the years underneath it, the cost of saying it to someone when you're a man who doesn't say things you aren't certain of. Jake, she said, I know it's not... He stopped. You came here to survive. Not to... I don't have a right to. Jake, she said it more firmly. He stopped. She looked at him directly the way she'd learned to look at things she wasn't going to turn away from. I came here to survive. That's true. She paused. But I've been alive in this kitchen in a way I haven't been anywhere in years. And that's... She chose her words with the care they deserved. That's not the job. That's you, and this place, and those men. She held his gaze. And I don't know what to do with that yet. But I know I'm not afraid of it. He looked at her for a long moment that had the quality of something settling, not an ending, but a foundation. That's enough, he said quietly. For now, that's enough. Outside, the storm was pulling back. The light was changing. The Kansas sky was doing what it always did after violence, returning to itself blue and enormous and indifferent to everything that had just happened beneath it. Inside a kitchen was warm. 2 men slept safely by a range. A boy of 19 was washing cups with the focus of someone learning that this is also what it means to be useful. A foreman was somewhere on the ranch doing the damage assessment with the steady purpose of a man who knows that what comes after a storm is always the work of putting things back together. And at the kitchen table, 2 people who had each lost everything they thought they were, and had each found in this unlikely place the beginning of something they hadn't known they were still capable of, sat across from each other in the quiet that comes after danger and breathed. I should check on Pete, she said finally. I'll check on the horses, he said. They stood. For a moment, they were both standing at the same time, in the same small space, and neither of them moved, and the distance between them was different from every distance they had stood at before, charged with something that had been named now, even though they had been careful with the naming. Even though they had agreed without words to be patient with it. He reached out. He put his hand briefly against hers. Not a hold, not a claim. Just the specific warmth of contact between 2 people who have decided quietly and without ceremony that they are no longer standing alone. Then he went to check on the horses. She went to check on Pete. And Circle M Ranch, battered and storm-marked and entirely intact, went about the business of the morning. The morning after the storm, Margaret found Garrett sitting up, not standing sitting, which was already more than the doctor who rode out from Willow Creek would later say he expected, with his splinted arm across his lap and a cup of coffee in his good hand, that Tommy had clearly brought him, and an expression on his face that she had never seen there before. Not the careful blankness he wore at meals. Something open. Something that looked on Garrett's particular face almost like gratitude trying to find its shape. She checked his arm first, pressed gently along the splint, watched his face for the quality of the pain. It was there, she could see it, but it was the clean pain of a bone held correctly, not the wrong kind. How's the feeling? She said. Hurts, he said. Good. That means the circulation's right. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said 4 words which for Garrett was a declaration, you said it clean. I've had one practice, she said. You were a better patient than my cook in Philadelphia. She fight you. She cried the entire time. He almost smiled. I thought about it, he said. She laughed genuinely, not the polished version. And Garrett, for the first time in 6 weeks at her table, laughed with her. It was a short laugh, unpracticed, like a door that hadn't been opened in a long time and needed a moment to remember how hinges worked. But it was real, and she heard it, and she felt it land in the same place that Tommy's words about home had landed on her very first evening. She thought this is what Jake meant, all along. This is exactly what he meant. She poured herself a coffee and sat beside him. Not across, and they drank in the comfortable silence of two people who have been through something together and don't need to narrate it. After a while, Garrett said, "Pete going to be all right?" "He's already all right," she said. "He ate 4 biscuits this morning. I take that as a full medical recovery." Another almost smile. "Good." She stood. "The doctor's coming from town this afternoon to confirm the arm. Don't let him convince you that I said it wrong. I didn't." Garrett looked at her with steady eyes. "I know," he said. She went back to the range. Outside, she could hear the ranch beginning its day, the sounds of men assessing storm damage of Jake's voice somewhere near the barn, giving direction of cattle that needed checking and fences that needed looking at, and the 1,000 ordinary tasks that a working ranch generates simply by existing. She started on breakfast. The motions were completely familiar now, the specific adjustment to the damper, the positioning of the bread on the right side, the timing she'd worked out through weeks of negotiation with a stove that had stopped fighting her somewhere around the 3rd week and had settled into something approaching cooperation. This kitchen was hers now. She had stopped thinking of it any other way. The doctor from Willow Creek was a man named Aldous Webb, somewhere past 60, with the manner of someone who had seen enough frontier medicine to be impressed by competence wherever it appeared, and unimpressed by credentials that didn't hold up. He examined Garrett's arm with thorough hands, checked the splint, checked the set, checked the healing that had already begun in the 14 hours since. He looked at Margaret over his spectacles. "You do this?" "I did. Medical training. Practical experience," she said. "Once before, and a good memory." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the arm. "It's set correctly," he said. "Better than some I've seen from men who claim training." He began to rewrap it with fresh cloth. The cold was the bigger concern. But he's through it. He glanced at Margaret again. "You kept him warm through the night." "I kept them both warm," she said. "Pete and Garrett. The range was running at full capacity." He nodded slowly. "The cold gets inside a man at that point, and it takes time to come back out. You did right." He finished with Garrett's arm and stood. "I'll come back in a week. Keep him from using it." "Tell him that," Margaret said. "I've already told him twice." Webb looked at Garrett, who was looking at his coffee, with the expression of a man pretending not to be in the conversation. "She's right," Webb said. 2 weeks minimum. Garrett said nothing, which Margaret had learned to read as agreement. Webb took his coffee, she'd had it ready without being asked, which he noticed, and sat at the work table while he finished it, and she let him, because she had learned that the kitchen was a place where people stayed a little longer than they meant to, and she had stopped finding reasons to hurry them out. "You been here long?" Webb asked. 7 weeks. He looked around the kitchen with the assessing eye of a man who's been in a lot of kitchens. "Jake Caldwell's had 3 cooks since his wife passed," he said. "None of them lasted 2 months. "I'm aware," she said. "You plan to stay?" She looked at him directly. "I plan to stay." He drank his coffee, nodded once. "Good," he said. "This ranch needs someone who plans." He left. She watched him go, and she felt the words settle in her chest the way words do when they land in the right place. Stay. Not survive. Not manage. Not get through the week and see. Stay. The twist came from a direction she had entirely stopped watching, which was perhaps why it hit her as hard as it did. A letter arrived on Thursday, 11 days after the storm, 17 days after Braddock's withdrawal, addressed to her. Not to Jake, not to Circle M Ranch generally, to Mrs. Margaret Sullivan. Circle M Ranch, Willow Creek, Kansas, in handwriting she recognized before she'd fully registered recognizing it. Her sister-in-law. Edward's younger sister Catherine, who lived in Boston, and who had sent one letter in the 8 months since Edward died, a brief, carefully worded letter that had said the right things and meant nothing. She stood in the hallway holding it and felt something in her go very still. She took it to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed. She opened it. Catherine had found a buyer for the remaining Sullivan assets, a small piece of property in Pennsylvania that Margaret had forgotten was in her name, not Edward's, and that had therefore survived the creditors. The sale had cleared $740 after fees. Catherine was writing to inform her and to ask where to send the funds. $740. She sat holding the letter for a long time. $740 was not a fortune, but it was not nothing. It was the difference between a woman who was entirely dependent on her employment continuing and a woman who had something to stand on, something of her own, something that could not be taken by a creditor or a bad season, or a man who decided she'd outlasted her usefulness. She sat with it for a long time, long enough that she missed the start of lunch preparation by 20 minutes and had to move fast to catch up, which she did, because that was what she did. But the letter sat in her apron pocket for the rest of the afternoon, and she was aware of it, the way you're aware of something that changes the shape of a room. That evening she went to the porch. Jake was there. He was always there in the evenings now, and she was always there, and they had both stopped pretending this was coincidence. She sat on the step. He poured her coffee from the pot he'd started keeping on the porch, specifically, which was a thing neither of them had mentioned. "I got a letter today," she said. He looked at her, said nothing. Let her take the space she needed. She told him about the property, about the $740. She told him plainly, the way she told him everything now, without softening it, without editorializing, just the facts, and then the thing underneath the facts. "So," she said, "I have money now. Not a great deal, but mine. Which means—" She paused. "Which means I'm not here because I have no choice." He was very still. "I was always here because I chose to be," she said carefully. "I want you to know that. Even when I had $12.40, I was choosing this. But now I need you to know that I have options. That this—" She stopped. Started again. "That when I tell you I'm staying, it's not because I can't afford to go." Jake set his cup down slowly. He looked at her with the expression she had finally fully learned to read, not controlled, not contained, but present. Entirely present. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. "Because you need to know," she said. "Because whatever," she picked her words, "whatever this becomes, between us, I need it to be between two people who chose it freely, not between a man with a ranch and a woman with no options." The silence that followed was the longest one yet, the kind that has weight and direction. "Margaret," he said. "I knew you had options," he said quietly. "I've known since the second week." She looked at him. "How?" "Because a woman who can read legal documents and manage 15 men and run a kitchen and set a broken arm at 6 in the morning, that woman has options wherever she goes." He held her gaze steadily. "I never thought you were here because you were trapped. I hoped you were here because it was worth staying." She felt something in her chest shift, the way tectonic things shift slowly and entirely, and without the possibility of going back. "It is," she said. He nodded, slowly. The way he nodded when something was true and he had room for it. They sat in the quiet for a while. Below them, the ranch settled into evening, and the sounds of it were so familiar now that she heard them the way you hear your own heartbeat, present, continuous, not something you notice until it stops. "Jake," she said. What are we doing?" "What?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the directness that she had come to value above almost any other quality in him, "I think we're deciding whether to build something." She looked at him. "What kind of something?" "The kind that lasts," he said. "The kind built on—" He stopped. She watched him search for words, which he did rarely, and with great care, and she let him search without filling the silence. "On knowing someone," he said finally. on watching them in a difficult thing and seeing what they're made of, on a pause, on wanting them in the room. She held very still. You want me in the room. I want you in every room, he said. Permanently. He looked at her directly. I'm not a man who says things I'm not certain of. I've been certain of this for some time. I didn't say it because I didn't know how you... He stopped. I didn't know if you were ready. She thought about ready. She thought about what ready meant for a woman who had spent 7 weeks becoming herself again in a kitchen in Kansas. She thought about the photograph in the box under her bed, which she had not looked at in 3 weeks. She thought about the first morning, 45 minutes burned fingers, and a 19-year-old boy who said her stew smelled like home. I'm ready, she said. He looked at her. She looked back. All right, he said, and his voice had something in it that she recognized as the sound of a man setting down something very heavy he'd been carrying for a very long time. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. They sat on the porch in the dark and drank their coffee, and did not say anything else for a while, because there was nothing else that needed saying tonight, and both of them understood deeply, practically in the bones, that what you build together doesn't start with words. It starts with showing up, day after day, choosing it, doing the work. She told Clara the next morning. Not everything she didn't have to. Clara looked at her face when she came into the kitchen and said simply, "Oh, thank God." Margaret laughed. "We haven't decided anything formally." "You've decided," Clara said with the certainty of a woman who has been watching two people circle something obvious for 7 weeks. "You've both decided. You're just being careful about how you announce it." "We're being thoughtful," Margaret said. "Thoughtful," Clara repeated in the tone of someone agreeing while disagreeing. "Is that what you're calling it?" She poured her own coffee and sat at the work table with the expression of a woman who is genuinely simply happy. Hector's going to say he saw it coming in the 2nd week. Hector would be wrong. It was at least the 4th week. I'll tell him 3. Give him the partial credit. Clara wrapped her hands around her cup. "Margaret, are you happy?" The question was so direct and so genuine that it stopped her mid-motion. She thought about it honestly the way she did everything now. She thought about what happy meant for someone who had learned not to trust easy happiness, who had paid a significant price for the version she'd had before, and understood now how little of it had been real. This was different. This was the kind of happy that had roots in it, that had been built from the bottom, from the daily work of showing up and being present and refusing to disappear even when disappearing would have been easier. "Yes," she said, "I am." Clara nodded once firmly with the satisfied expression of someone whose faith has been confirmed. "Good," she said. "Now, what are we making for breakfast?" The second twist came from the men, and it came in the form of Tommy. He appeared in the kitchen doorway on a Saturday afternoon, Margaret's half-day, which she usually spent in the quiet of her room reading, though lately she'd been spending it on the porch or in the office with Jake, going over ranch accounts, which was its own kind of reading, with the expression of someone who had been elected spokesperson for a group decision. "We want to do something," he said. She set down the Whitman she'd been reading, borrowed from the pantry box 2 weeks ago, with Jake's full knowledge and a look between them that had said everything that needed saying about what that meant. "What kind of something? For you and Jake?" He came into the kitchen and stood at the work table with the serious expression of a young man who has thought this through carefully. "The men, all of us, Hector too, and Rodrigo, and Luis, and even Pete, who can barely walk straight still, we want to do something to say." He stopped. "It's hard to say exactly." "Try," she said. He looked at her. "You came here, and the ranch was fine. It worked. The cattle got moved and the fences got fixed and the work got done, but it wasn't—" He searched for the word she'd heard him searching for once before. "It wasn't alive. And then you came and made it alive again, and we want to say that." He paused. "And also that we think Jake's lucky, and that we hope you stay." She looked at him for a long moment. This boy, This 18? No, he'd had a birthday 3 weeks ago. She'd made him a cake, and he'd been speechless for 30 seconds, which was the most gratifying 30 seconds of her culinary career. This 19-year-old boy from Missouri, who had told her on the first morning that her stew smelled like home, and had proceeded in 7 weeks to become something she did not have an adequate word for. Not a son. Something in that direction, but its own thing, its own category. "Tommy," she said. "Ma'am, what did you have in mind?" He told her. It was a dinner, a real one, not a workday meal. A deliberate sitting down together with the good dishes that she'd discovered in a cabinet and never used because there'd been no occasion. The men wanted to cook it, or try to. They wanted her to stay out of the kitchen for one evening and let them attempt it. She stared at him. "You want to cook? Hector's going to be in charge," Tommy said quickly. "He knows the most, and Clara's going to advise. We're not, we know our limitations." She thought about 15 men attempting a formal dinner in her kitchen. She thought about what would happen to the stove. She thought about the dishes. "You'll follow the damper adjustment exactly as I've shown you," she said. "Hector knows it. You won't put bread on the left side. Clara told us 3 times. And you'll—" "Margaret." He said her name, not ma'am her name, which he'd only started doing recently and which she had not told him not to do. "Let us do this, please." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Fine. But if you ruin my pots, I will be genuinely upset." He grinned with his whole face. "Yes, ma'am." He left at speed before she could reconsider. She told Jake that afternoon. He listened with the expression of a man calculating how much damage 15 cowboys could do to a kitchen. "Hector's supervising," she said. "Hector can't bake. Clara's advising." He thought about it. "The stove? I've already covered the stove." He looked at her. She looked back. He said slowly, "You're going to let them do this." "It means something to them," she said. "That's more important than the pots." He looked at her with that expression, the one she'd stopped classifying, the one she simply lived inside. Now the way you live inside something that has become home. "You know," he said, "when I wrote that advertisement, I wrote serious applicants only. I remember. I was trying to filter out people who were looking for something easy." He paused. "I had no idea what I was actually asking for." She tilted her head. "What were you asking for?" He looked at her directly. "Someone who understood that the hard things are the important things, that you don't build anything worth having by avoiding difficulty." He paused. "Someone who would set a broken arm at 6 in the morning and then make biscuits and not mention either one as anything unusual." She held his gaze. "That's a very specific person." "Yes," he said. "It is." He reached across the desk and took her hand, not briefly, not in passing, but deliberately, the way you take something you intend to keep. "It's you." She looked at their hands. She thought about the first day, the dropped bags, the 45 minutes, $12.40. She thought about the long path from that woman to this one, and she understood that the path had not been a detour, it had been the whole point. Every burned biscuit and legal document and storm-dark morning had been the path, and the path had led here to this desk, to this hand in hers. "I have a condition," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "You're negotiating." "I'm always negotiating." She kept her hand in his. "I want to write, not letters. I mean, I want to keep accounts. The legal correspondence, the financial records. I want to be useful in that capacity, not just in the kitchen." He looked at her. "You think I'd say no to that?" "I think you might say it's not necessary." "It's entirely necessary," he said. "I've been drowning in the accounts for 3 years." "I know," she said. "I've seen them." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was almost amusement. "You've looked at my accounts. The night I looked at the deed documents, the account ledger was right there. I looked at it for approximately 45 seconds. And Your cattle expenditure column is catastrophically disorganized." He laughed that full, unguarded laugh that she had heard exactly 4 times, and that still every single time hit her like something physical. "All right," he said. "You can organize the cattle expenditure column." "And everything else," she said. "And everything else," he agreed. She nodded. "Then I accept." "You accept," he repeated. "I haven't formally asked you anything." "You said permanently," she said. "On the porch. That's asking." He looked at her for a long moment, and his expression had layers in it. The gratitude, and the history, and the 4 years of weight being slowly set down, and something new growing in the space where the weight had been. "I suppose it is," he said. "It is," she said. He lifted her hand. He held it for a moment, turning it slightly, as if he was still getting used to the particular fact of it, this hand that had set Garrett's arm and kneaded bread and read legal documents, and had been from the first morning absolutely unwilling to stop. "Margaret Sullivan," he said. "Jake Caldwell," she said. "Stay," he said. "I already told you," she said. "I'm staying." The dinner the men made was imperfect and wonderful in exactly the proportion she would have predicted. The bread was slightly overdone on the bottom. Someone had put it too far left, despite all warnings. And the roast was uneven, with one end more cooked than the other. And someone had added too much salt to the potatoes, which Luis had to quietly admit because he was constitutionally unable to let someone else take the blame for a mistake he'd made. But the table was set with the good dishes every place, and someone had put the lamp in the center, and it threw a warm light over everything. And the men were sitting in their chairs with the sheepish pride of people who have attempted something outside their competence and are not entirely sure how it went. Hector stood at the head of the table. Jake's place was empty. Jake and Margaret were still in the hallway, and when they came through the door, all 15 men looked at them with the expression of a group that has collectively decided something and is holding it slightly awkwardly, the way groups hold things that belong more to individual hearts than to group performance. Tommy spoke. Of course Tommy spoke. He had been elected, she was certain of it. "We wanted to—" He stopped, started again. "We wanted to say thank you, to both of you." He looked at Margaret specifically. "You came here and you made this place." He stopped a third time, and she saw in his face the same search for words she'd seen before, the reaching for something that was slightly larger than what he had. "You made it matter," he said finally. "The eating together, the talking, the—" He waved a hand vaguely at the kitchen, at the ranch, at everything. "You made it matter." The room was very quiet. She looked at these men, at Hector, dignified and steady, at Rodrigo, who had carried Garrett through a storm, at Luis, who was finally fully at home at this table, at Pete, who still moved carefully but was here present recovering, at Garrett, arms splinted, sitting straight, with that door that learned to open expression she'd first seen 3 days ago, at Tommy, who was 19 years old and already becoming someone remarkable. She thought, "I came here with 2 bags and no plan, and the only thing I had was the inability to quit." She thought, "Look what that built." She looked at Jake beside her. He was looking at the table, at the men, at the effort of the meal, at the good dishes, with the expression of a man who has come back to his own life and found it better than he left it. He put his hand at the small of her back. Not a grand gesture, just placement. "I am here, you are here, we are here," and she felt it through her whole body. She looked at Tommy. "Thank you," she said. "All of you." She paused. "Although someone put bread on the left side of the stove." The room erupted. Tommy's hand went to his face. Hector turned to look at someone on his left. 3 men spoke at once. Luis buried his face briefly in his hands, and she laughed, the real, full, unguarded version that she had rediscovered in this kitchen, in this place, among these people who had needed her, and had, in needing her, given her something she hadn't known. She still needed the proof that she was still capable of being necessary, of being present, of building something from the rubble of what had fallen. Jake laughed beside her. She felt it as much as heard it. She thought, there it is. There is the thing he could not name in an advertisement and could not ask for directly. There it is in this room, in this mess of imperfect bread and oversalted potatoes, and 15 men who tried. Season it with laughter. She had not understood it on the first day. She understood it now completely. It was not a cooking instruction. It was not a policy. It was the thing that separates a place where people exist from a place where people live. The thing that tells a man coming in from 12 hours of hard work that someone in there is paying attention, that the evening will be different from the day, that he is not just a function of his labor, but a person in a room with other people who know his name. It was the thing that had been missing for 4 years, and it was the thing she had brought, not because she'd meant to, not because she'd known, but because she was who she was and could not be otherwise. She sat down at the table. Jake sat beside her, not at the head beside her, which was a choice, and everyone at the table registered it as such. Hector began to pass the dishes. The meal moved around the table with the sound of people who are comfortable enough with each other to argue good-naturedly about whether the potatoes need more salt, despite the existing salt situation, and whether the bread is really that bad, or whether they're being dramatic, and whether Garrett is allowed a second helping given that he can only use one arm. She ate imperfect bread, and oversalted potatoes, and a roast that was uneven and excellent, and she sat at a table full of men who had tried, and she felt for the first time, in longer than she could precisely calculate, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because she had no choice. Not because survival had narrowed her options down to this one. Because she had chosen it. With her whole self. With full knowledge. On purpose. Later, after the meal, after the cleaning, after the men had gone back to the bunkhouse with the particular satisfaction of people who have accomplished something they weren't sure they could, she and Jake sat on the porch one more time. The sky was enormous and clear and full of stars. The Kansas dark was the kind that has no edges, that goes all the way to the ground and all the way up to whatever is above stars, and she had stopped finding it frightening around week 3 and had started finding it somewhere around week 5, the most beautiful thing she had ever regularly experienced. She had not told anyone this, but she thought Jake knew. He had the Whitman open again, but he wasn't reading. He was looking at the same sky she was looking at. After a while he said, "Do you miss it, Philadelphia?" She thought about it honestly. "I miss the library," she said. "The public library on Locust Street. The smell of it." She paused. "I miss spring there, the way it comes in suddenly." She paused again. "I don't miss my life there, which is not the same as the place." "No," he said. "It's not. Do you miss—" She stopped. She had been careful about this question. About his wife, about his son, about the life before. She had never pressed it. "I miss them every day," he said quietly. "That doesn't change. It just—" He looked at the sky. "It found a place to live that's not in the way of everything else." He paused. "She would have liked you." She looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because she had no patience for pretense," he said. "And neither do you. Because she believed in the work and the dailiness of it, the doing it every day without waiting to feel like it, and so do you." He paused. "And because she would have found the thing with the pie at breakfast hilarious." She smiled. "She sounds like someone I would have liked too." "Yes," he said simply. "I think so." They sat with that, with the room they'd made for the people. They'd each lost the ones they carried, the ones who had shaped them into the people who could recognize each other. Not a ghost between them. A presence acknowledged, honored, settled. He reached over and took her hand. Full deliberate the way he'd done at the desk. She let him. She turned her hand and held his back, and they sat like that under the Kansas stars, and she felt the specific peace of a woman who has stopped running from what she's lost and started building with what she has. "Jake," she said. I want to plant a kitchen garden in the spring." He looked at her. "All right. On the south side of the house. Herbs and tomatoes, and I want to try apples. I know it's difficult in this climate, but I've been reading about the varieties that hold." "I'll fence it," he said, "so the cattle stay out." She nodded. And I want bookshelves in the front room, not just the pantry. I'll build them. And I want—" She stopped. "Tell me," he said. She looked at him. At this man who had written serious applicants only because he didn't know how else to say he needed someone who understood that difficulty was where meaning lived, who had kept poetry he couldn't read because he couldn't let it go, who had handed her the drawer with everything in it because he'd looked at her and decided in the quiet way he decided things that she could be trusted with what mattered most. "I want Sunday mornings to be ours," she said. "Not for the ranch, not for the accounts. Just coffee on the porch, and the book, and whatever we have to say to each other." She paused. "I don't want to be busy every minute. I want to have space in it." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face that was not quite the expression she knew, something past it, something she hadn't seen before, that was very simply and completely happiness. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that settles in quietly and stays. "Sunday mornings," he said. "Yes." She nodded. She looked back at the sky. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a stage in Willow Creek with 2 bags and $12.40 and the absolute refusal to lie down in the face of what had happened to her. She thought about all the ways that woman had been wrong about what survival looked like, had thought it was solitary, had thought it was armor, had thought it meant keeping yourself small and protected and uninvested in outcomes that could be taken. She thought about what she knew now. Survival was the stove on the first morning, and the pie at breakfast, and reading documents at 11 o'clock at night, and laughing at burned biscuits, and setting a broken arm, and refusing to let Braddock sit down anywhere near the truth. Survival was choosing every day on purpose, with full knowledge to show up and stay. "Jake," she said. You were right." He looked at her. "About what specifically?" "About the condition," she said. "The laughter." She looked at him. "It is what keeps a place alive. You were right about that from the beginning." He looked at her with those quiet, certain eyes. "You're what keeps this place alive," he said. "The laughter came with you." She held his gaze and felt the truth of it, not as flattery, not as sentiment, but as the plain, specific fact of what had happened in 7 weeks in a kitchen in Kansas, in a ranch that had needed someone who would not stop, who would read the documents and make the pie and season the food and laugh at herself and stand her ground and stay. She had arrived with nothing but the nerve to stay. It had been in the end the only thing required. The stars burned overhead, indifferent and permanent, and Circle M Ranch settled into the night, its fences standing, its cattle counted, its men sleeping, its kitchen clean, its books on the shelf, its porch holding 2 people who had each survived the unsurvivable and had found in the dailiness of hard work and honest living that survival was only ever the beginning. What came after survival was this, a hand in yours in the dark. Sunday mornings set aside, kitchen gardens planned for spring, bookshelves to be built, a stove that had stopped fighting and started cooperating, a table that was never silent anymore. A home is not a place. Jake Caldwell had known that for 4 years in the space where his home used to be and could not have said it until now. A home is the person who teaches you how to laugh again and then stays to make sure you don't forget. Margaret Sullivan had come 900 miles to survive. She had stayed to live, and that in the end was everything.